Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking secrets. A time when your innocent Victorian great-grandmother was likely higher than a kite every single day of her life. Picture this. It's 1885, and Mrs. Zelina Hartford steps into her elegant Boston parlor, reaches for her morning medicine cabinet, and consumes more cocaine before breakfast than most people see in a lifetime. But here's the twist. She has no idea she's doing it. None of them did. Welcome to the era when an entire generation of women became accidental drug addicts, all while maintaining perfect posture and impeccable manners. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I'd love for you to join our growing community of history lovers. If you're enjoying this journey through time, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps us share these forgotten stories with more curious minds like yours. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something magical about knowing we're all exploring history together from different corners of the world. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step into a world where medicine cabinets were more dangerous than street corners. The year was 1880, and if you walked into any respectable American home, you'd find something that would absolutely shock you today. Every medicine cabinet, every kitchen pantry, every lady's vanity table was stocked with enough narcotics to supply a modern-day cartel. But this wasn't some underground drug operation. This was perfectly legal, doctor-recommended, and considered the height of civilized living. Let me paint you a picture of Margaret Whitmore's morning routine in Philadelphia, 1883. She wakes up and immediately reaches for her bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Not for a baby, mind you, but for her own nervous constitution. One spoonful contains enough morphine to knock out a horse, but the label cheerfully promises it will restore feminine tranquility. Next, she applies her complexion cream laced with cocaine to invigorate the skin and awaken natural beauty. She brushes her teeth with cocaine-infused tooth powder, advertised as essential for maintaining moral cleanliness and social acceptability. By 9 a.m., before she's even had breakfast, Margaret has consumed more controlled substances than most people encounter in their entire lives. And she's not alone. She's just following her doctor's orders and the social expectations of a proper Victorian lady. The statistics from this era are absolutely mind-boggling. A single bottle of popular children's cough syrup contained the equivalent of what we consider multiple doses of heroin today. Patent medicine sales in America reached $74 million annually by 1900. That's over $2.5 billion in today's money. All spent on products that were essentially liquid addiction in fancy bottles. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. These weren't products hidden in dark alleys or sold by shady characters. They were advertised in ladies' magazines, endorsed by prominent physicians, and sold in the finest department stores. Macy's in New York had an entire floor dedicated to medicinal preparations for the discerning woman. Sears and Robot catalogs featured pages upon pages of cocaine-laced products, right next to kitchen appliances and Sunday dresses. Dr. William Hammond, the former Surgeon General of the United States Army, publicly endorsed cocaine as a valuable remedy for mental depression and nervous exhaustion. And the Boston Medical Journal published glowing reviews of cocaine. Treatments for everything from hay fever to excessive emotionalism in the female temperament. These weren't quack doctors operating from wagon trains. These were Harvard-educated physicians writing in the most prestigious medical publications of their time. The social pressure to use these products was immense. Victorian society had very specific ideas about how women should behave. Calm, cheerful, never too emotional, always perfectly groomed, and completely devoted to their families. But here's the cruel irony. The very substances they used to achieve this impossible standard were making them increasingly erratic, dependent, and ultimately quite mad. Take the case of Elizabeth Morrison, a well-documented socialite from Boston's Beacon Hill. Her diary, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, chronicles her descent from a composed Victorian lady to what she herself described as a creature possessed by demons. It started innocently enough. Her physician prescribed Wagner's cocoa wine for her melancholic tendencies. Within 6 months, she was consuming 3 bottles daily and had begun experiencing what we now recognize as cocaine-induced psychosis. But the most chilling part, her husband, her doctor, and her entire social circle attributed her increasingly erratic behavior to feminine hysteria and prescribed even stronger medications. The very people who should have helped her were unknowingly pushing her deeper into addiction. The pharmaceutical companies of the era were masterful marketers. They understood that Victorian women were trapped between impossible expectations and limited outlets for frustration. Advertisements didn't just sell medicine, they sold solutions to social problems. Tired of being tired? Try Dr. Peterson's Vigor Tonic. Struggling with domestic burdens? Madame Laurent's Nerve Calmer will restore your natural cheerfulness. Feeling overwhelmed by modern life? Professor Williams' Lady's Friend contains everything you need to face your day with confidence. What they didn't mention was that Professor Williams' Lady's Friend contained enough cocaine to power a small locomotive. The dosages recommended were staggering. A typical nerve tonic contained between 1/8 to 1/4 grain of cocaine per fluid ounce, and the recommended dose was often 2 spoons, 3 times daily. To put this in perspective, modern medical cocaine use, when it's used at all, involves doses measured in milligs, not grains. These women were consuming therapeutic doses that would be considered massive, even by today's recreational standards. The geographic spread of this phenomenon was truly national, from the bustling cities of the Northeast to the frontier towns of the West, from plantation houses in the South to logging camps in the Pacific Northwest. Cocaine-laced medicines were as common as coffee and twice as popular. The United States Patent Office records show over 3,000 different patent medicines registered between 1875 and 1905, and an estimated 80% contained significant amounts of cocaine, morphine, alcohol, or combinations of all three. But perhaps most heartbreaking were the testimonials from women who genuinely believed these products were helping them. Letters to pharmaceutical companies preserved in various historical archives revealed the tragic cycle of addiction disguised as medical treatment. "Your wonderful tonic has given me the strength to manage my household duties with grace," wrote one woman, not realizing that her newfound strength was chemical dependence, masquerading as feminine virtue. The social consequences rippled through every level of Victorian society. Dinner parties became inadvertent drug-fueled gatherings. Church socials turned into unconscious cocaine circles. Women's charitable organizations were unknowingly organized and run by groups of addicted volunteers who attributed their unusual energy and focus to moral superiority rather than chemical stimulation. What makes this historical moment so fascinating and terrifying is how normalized it all became. These weren't dramatic addiction stories in the traditional sense. There were no rock-bottom moments or obvious signs of substance abuse. Instead, it was a slow society-wide descent into chemical dependency, disguised as the pursuit of health, beauty, and social respectability. The medical establishment's role in this crisis cannot be overstated. Physicians of the era had limited understanding of addiction, virtually no knowledge of drug interactions, and enormous pressure to provide quick fixes for complex social and psychological problems. When a woman complained of depression, anxiety, or simple exhaustion from managing a household without modern conveniences, the easiest solution was a bottle of patent medicine that would make her feel better immediately, regardless of long-term consequences. As we sit here tonight, more than a century later, it's easy to judge the ignorance of the past. But remember, these were intelligent, well-meaning people, making the best decisions they could with the information available to them. They trusted their doctors, followed social conventions, and genuinely believed they were taking care of their health and their families. The parallels to our modern world are both obvious and unsettling. We live in an era of prescription opioids, anxiety medications, and an entire wellness industry built on the promise that there's a product for every problem. The packaging has changed. The regulations have improved. But the fundamental human desire for a simple solution to complex problems remains exactly the same. What happened next in this incredible story will absolutely amaze you, because just as this chemical dependency was reaching its peak, some remarkable women began to notice that something wasn't quite right. Their journey from unconscious addiction to awareness, rebellion, and ultimately reform would reshape American society forever. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without a fight. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the very pharmaceutical companies that created this crisis became some of the most powerful and manipulative forces in American business history, and how their marketing tactics evolved from simple product promotion to sophisticated psychological manipulation that would make modern advertising executives weep with envy. Now imagine walking into the boardroom of Parke-Davidson Company in Detroit, 1884. The mahogany table gleams under gaslight, and around it sit some of the most brilliant marketing minds of the Victorian era. But these aren't selling soap or sewing machines. They're crafting campaigns to hook an entire generation of women on substances that would make modern drug dealers blush. What they created wasn't just advertising. It was the blueprint for America's first corporate-sponsored addiction epidemic. The pharmaceutical industry of the 1880s was operating in what we might call a regulatory Wild West. There were no FDA approvals, no ingredient labeling requirements, no clinical trials, and absolutely no oversight of marketing claims. Into this vacuum stepped companies that would make today's most aggressive marketers look like amateurs. They didn't just sell products. They manufactured demand for solutions to problems they themselves invented. Considered the genius, and I use that term with deep irony, of Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root campaign. The Kilmer Company didn't just advertise their cocaine-laced kidney remedy. They first launched a massive public education campaign about kidney weakness, a condition that supposedly affected 75% of all American women. Suddenly, perfectly healthy women were diagnosing themselves with symptoms they'd never noticed before. Occasional fatigue, mild back pain, or simple moodiness became signs of this newly discovered epidemic. The numbers behind these campaigns were staggering. By 1895, patent medicine companies were spending more on advertising than any other industry in America. Over $40 million annually, equivalent to roughly $1.4 billion today. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. They were spending this money with surgical precision, targeting women's magazines, church newsletters, and ladies' social publications, with messages specifically designed to exploit Victorian anxieties about femininity, health, and social status. Have you ever wondered how advertising became so sophisticated so quickly? The patent medicine industry was the laboratory where modern marketing psychology was born. They pioneered techniques we still see today: celebrity endorsements, before and after testimonials, limited time offers, and the creation of artificial urgency around health concerns. Take the case of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which became one of the most successful patent medicines in American history. Lydia Pinkham herself became the first female brand spokesperson, her grandmotherly face appearing in advertisements across the country. The compound contained 18% alcohol and significant amounts of cocaine, but it was marketed as a natural remedy for female complaints, a Victorian euphemism for everything from menstrual cramps to what we would now recognize as clinical depression. The company's marketing was revolutionary. They created detailed pamphlets explaining women's health in language that seemed scientific, but was actually designed to increase anxiety. They established a customer service department, the first of its kind, humble, where women could write letters describing their symptoms and receive personalized advice, along with recommendations for increased dosages. These weren't medical consultations. They were sophisticated sales funnels disguised as healthcare. But perhaps most insidiously, they understood the power of social proof. The company paid women to host pink parties in their homes, where neighbors would gather to hear testimonials about the compound's miraculous effects. These weren't just product demonstrations. They were peer pressure campaigns that transformed drug distribution into social entertainment. Imagine your book club, but everyone's gradually becoming addicted to cocaine, laced tonics, and attributing their newfound energy to moral improvement. The pharmaceutical companies also pioneered what we now call lifestyle marketing. They didn't just sell medicine, they sold an identity. A woman who used a Pierce's favorite prescription wasn't just treating her nerves. She was embracing modern scientific womanhood. Someone who relied on Hosteta's celebrated stomach beaters wasn't just managing digestion. She was demonstrating her commitment to progressive American values. The language used in these advertisements was masterfully crafted. Instead of saying contains cocaine, labels would read fortified with natural Peruvian extract. Rather than morphine, they'd list concentrated poppy essence. The word addictive didn't exist in their vocabulary. Instead, they spoke of forming beneficial daily habits and creating healthful dependencies that strengthen feminine constitution. Dusk Took William Radham's Microkiller provides a perfect example of how these companies manufactured both fear and solution simultaneously. Radham first published pamphlets about the microtheory of disease, the idea that invisible organisms were causing illness throughout American society. This wasn't entirely wrong scientifically, but Radham's version was designed to create maximum anxiety. He claimed that 99% of all human ailments were caused by microbes, and that most people were walking around infected without knowing it. Then came the solution, Microkiller, a pink liquid that contained mercury, hydrochloric acid, and red wine. The marketing promised it would kill every harmful microbe in the human body. The reality was that it was too slowly poisoning customers. while making them feel temporarily energetic due to its stimulant properties. But here's the brilliant part. When customers started feeling worse, Rodham's literature explained that this was evidence the treatment was working, that they were experiencing beneficial healing reactions as the microbes died off. By 1890, Rodham was selling 50,000 bottles monthly and had established distribution networks across the United States, Canada, Theodore, and even Europe. His success spawned dozens of imitators, each claiming to have discovered an even more effective microbe-killing formula. The competition led to an arms race of increasingly potent and dangerous formulations. The geographic expansion of these companies reads like an invasion plan. They started in major cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, where they could access wealthy women and establish medical networks. Then they systematically expanded westward, following the railroad lines and establishing distribution networks in every town with more than 500 residents. By 1900, you could buy patent medicines in general stores from Maine to California, from Minnesota to Texas. The companies understood regional psychology to conservative religious communities. They emphasized moral purity and spiritual health. In progressive urban areas, they promoted scientific advancement and modern efficiency. In frontier towns, they promised strength and endurance for harsh living conditions. Same products, different in messaging, all designed to make local women feel that these medicines were specifically created for their unique circumstances. But perhaps most cleverly, they created what economists would now call artificial scarcity. Limited edition formulations, seasonal availability, and exclusive regional distributions made women feel they needed to stock up when the opportunity arose. Many households had medicine cabinets that looked more like pharmacies, with dozens of different bottles, containing variations of essentially the same cocaine and alcohol formula. The testimonial industry became a sophisticated operation. Companies employed writers to create believable personal stories from fictional customers. They paid real customers to provide enthusiastic endorsements. They even hired actresses to appear at public demonstrations, sharing dramatic before and after stories of their transformations. These weren't just advertisements. They were early forms of pharmaceutical theater. One of the most successful was Mrs. Joe Person's Remedy, which claimed to cure everything from blood disorders to female irregularities. Mrs. Person herself toured the South, speaking at churches and women's clubs about her miraculous recovery from various ailments. What audiences didn't know was that Mrs. Person's Remedy contained enough cocaine to maintain her enthusiastic energy throughout these grueling speaking tours, creating a feedback loop where the drug's effects validated the testimonials that sold more drugs. The social implications were staggering. Entire communities became inadvertently synchronized in their chemical dependency. Church choirs sang with unusual vigor because half the sopranos were on cocaine-laced throat lozenges. Garden clubs planned increasingly elaborate events because their members were consuming stimulant-infused nerve tonics. Women's suffrage meetings had unusual energy and focus because attendees were unknowingly under the influence of various patent medicines. The economic impact extended far beyond the pharmaceutical companies themselves. Entire industries emerged to support this chemical lifestyle. Specialized glass bottle manufacturers, label printing companies, cork suppliers, and shipping networks. Thousands of Americans found employment in what was essentially a massive legal drug distribution system. But the most tragic aspect was how the success of these marketing campaigns created a self-reinforcing cycle. As more women used these products and experienced their temporary energizing effects, they became living advertisements for pharmaceutical solutions to life's challenges. Their testimonials weren't lies. They genuinely felt better while under the influence. The problem was that better was chemically induced and ultimately unsustainable. The companies also pioneered subscription models, encouraging customers to establish regular delivery schedules for their medicines. This created predictable revenue streams, while ensuring customers never ran out of their daily doses. It was an early form of automatic renewal, but instead of magazines or newspapers, people were subscribing to their own addiction. As these marketing empires grew more sophisticated and profitable, they began to attract attention from an unexpected source: the very women they were targeting. Some customers started to notice patterns that the companies hoped would remain invisible. But the story of how Victorian women began to fight back against this corporate manipulation involves some of the most remarkable acts of courage and detective work in American history. Coming up next, we'll step inside the actual homes where this chemical transformation was taking place daily. You'll meet women whose morning routines involved more controlled substances than most people encounter in a lifetime. and discover how the simple act of cleaning house became a gateway to a world of pharmaceutical-induced mania. Picture Sarah Mitchell standing in her pristine Boston kitchen on a Tuesday morning in 1887, armed with what she believes are the tools of domestic perfection. But this isn't your typical cleaning routine. Sarah's cabinet holds bottles of Miracle Kitchen Cleanser infused with enough cocaine to fuel a small army, spotless surface polish containing morphine derivatives, and Heavenly Home Refresher. That's basically liquid stimulants disguised as cleaning supplies. What happens next would make even the most dedicated modern housekeeper question everything they thought they knew about spring cleaning. The domestic cleaning industry of the 1880s had discovered something remarkable. If you put cocaine in household products, women would clean with the intensity of someone preparing for a royal inspection. And Victorian society, obsessed with moral cleanliness being reflected in physical cleanliness, embraced this chemical assistance with open arms and tightly closed minds. Sarah's morning routine began at 6 a.m. with what she called her preparation ritual. First, she'd take a generous swig of Dr. Hamilton's Housewife's Helper, marketed as a digestive aid for busy women, but actually containing a cocaine concentration that would make modern emergency room doctors panic. Within 15 minutes, Sarah felt energized, focused, and ready to tackle her domestic duties with what she described in her diary as supernatural vigor. But here's where the story gets truly wild. The cleaning products themselves were equally loaded with stimulants. Mrs. Beaton's all-purpose surface cleaner contained cocaine hydrochloride, marketed as a natural cleaning accelerant that invigorates both surfaces and spirits. The logic, according to the manufacturer's literature, was that cocaine would help women work faster, while simultaneously absorbing through the skin to maintain their energy levels throughout the day. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever cleaned your house and felt unusually energetic afterward? These Victorian women were essentially getting high from their housework, but they attributed their manic cleaning sessions to moral superiority and proper feminine dedication. The Pennsylvania Historical Society preserves letters from dozens of women describing their cleaning experiences in terms that sound more like drug testimonials than housekeeping reports. "I find myself able to scrub for hours without fatigue," wrote Mary Henderson from Pittsburgh in 1888. "The floors shine with such brilliance, and I myself feel illuminated from within. I have reorganized every closet, polished every surface, and still feel capable of tackling the neighbor's home as well." What Mary didn't realize was that she was experiencing a textbook cocaine high while performing domestic labor. Her illumination from within was chemical. Her endless energy was pharmaceutical, and her desire to clean the neighbor's house was a classic symptom of stimulant-induced hyperactivity. The product names alone tell an incredible story of marketing genius meeting chemical ignorance. Vigor, our scrubbing compound, promised to transform tedious housework into invigorating exercise. Sparkling Solutions, all-purpose cleaner, claimed to brighten both your home and your disposition through natural botanical energizers. Efficient Ladies Cleaning Arsenal advertised itself as containing South American plant extracts that enhance both cleaning power and feminine vitality. Every single one of these products contains significant amounts of cocaine, often combined with alcohol, caffeine, and various other stimulants. Women weren't just cleaning their homes. They were essentially conducting chemistry experiments while under the influence of powerful drugs. The economic impact was staggering. By 1890, American households were spending an average of $47 annually on specialized cleaning products, equivalent to nearly what's shanned in today's money. But families weren't just buying one or two products. They were purchasing entire arsenals of chemically enhanced cleaning supplies, each designed for specific tasks and containing different combinations of stimulants. The social pressure to maintain spotless homes using these products was immense. Victorian women competed over the cleanliness of their houses with the same intensity that modern families might compete over their children's academic achievements. But this competition was fueled by chemistry, not just determination. Consider the case of the Hartford Ladies Domestic Excellence Society, documented in the Connecticut Historical Society archives. This was a social club where women would gather weekly to discuss housekeeping techniques and share product recommendations. What they were actually doing was enabling each other's chemical dependency while disguising it as moral improvement. Meeting minutes from 1889 described scenes that sound more like drug user support groups than ladies' tea parties. Mrs. Woodbridge shared her discovery of applying Dr. Morrison's Surface Energizer twice daily rather than the recommended once, resulting in floors so pristine they seemed to glow with inner light. Miss Patterson demonstrated her technique of combining 3 different cleaning tonics: achieving results that left the entire room sparkling and herself feeling capable of conquering any domestic challenge. These women were essentially comparing drug cocktail recipes while believing they were sharing housekeeping tips. The physical toll was enormous, though rarely recognized for what it actually was. Victorian medical journals from the period document a mysterious epidemic of what they called housewives, trembling women experiencing handshakes, rapid heartbeats, and episodes of what they termed cleaning frenzy. Dr. James Morrison's 1891 paper in the Boston Medical Review describes patients who would clean obsessively for 8 to 10 hours straight, then collapse in exhaustion, only to repeat the cycle the next day. What Dr. Morrison was actually documenting was cocaine withdrawal and dependency, but neither he nor his patients understood the connection between their cleaning products and their symptoms. Instead, these episodes were attributed to excessive moral dedication, or an overabundance of feminine virtue expressing itself through domestic perfection. The children in these households were inadvertently caught up in this chemical cleaning culture. Kids playing in freshly cleaned rooms were exposed to cocaine residue on every surface. Many developed what parents proudly called helpful energy. Children who would spontaneously organize toy boxes, dust furniture, or engage in other cleaning activities with unusual intensity and focus. In reality, these children were experiencing contact highs from the cocaine-infused cleaning products their mothers used throughout the house. Pediatric medical records from the era show unusual patterns of hyperactivity, sleeping problems, and what doctors called precocious domestic interests among children in wealthy households that could afford the latest cleaning products. The geographic spread of this phenomenon followed economic lines precisely. Wealthy neighborhoods in major cities saw the highest concentrations of chemically enhanced cleaning product use. Department store records from New York's Upper Fifth Avenue show that affluent households were purchasing 3-4 times more cleaning products than middle-class families and paying premium prices for products with the highest cocaine content. But the middle class aspired to this chemical cleanliness. Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs began featuring starter sets of cleaning products, specifically marketed to families seeking to elevate their domestic standards. These sets typically included 6 to 8 different products, each containing different stimulant combinations, allowing families to create their own customized cleaning chemistry. The time management aspect was revolutionary for its era. Victorian women using these products could accomplish in 4 or 5 hours what would normally take an entire day of cleaning. But rather than gaining leisure time, most used their chemical efficiency to raise their cleaning standards to impossible levels. Baseboards weren't just cleaned, they were polished to mirror brightness. Windows weren't just washed, they were made so transparent they seemed to disappear. Floors weren't just swept and mopped, they were scrubbed, polished, and buffed until they reflected ceiling fixtures with a crystalline clarity. The industry responded to this escalation by creating increasingly potent formulations. Super-strength domestic solutions appeared in 1892, containing cocaine concentrations that would double the original products. Professional-grade home cleaning systems were marketed to women who wanted to achieve commercial-level results in residential settings. By the mid-1890s, some cleaning products contained cocaine concentrations that would have been dangerous even for experienced medical patients. But Victorian women, convinced that their increased energy and obsessive attention to detail were signs of moral improvement, enthusiastically embraced these increasingly powerful formulations. The physiological effects extended far beyond simple energy increases. Many women developed what we would now recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors around cleaning. They would polish the same surface dozens of times, reorganize closets daily, and spend hours arranging household objects with mathematical precision. But Victorian society interpreted these behaviors as evidence of exceptional feminine virtue and domestic skill. The crash cycles were brutal, but rarely understood. After 68 hours of chemically fueled cleaning marathons, women would experience what they called virtuous exhaustion, complete physical collapse, depression, and an inability to perform even basic tasks. Rather than recognizing this as drug withdrawal, they attributed these crashes to having worked so hard that they temporarily depleted their feminine energy reserves. The solution, according to both the medical establishment and the cleaning product industry, was more medicine and more products. Women experiencing post-cleaning crashes were encouraged to take restorative tonics, more cocaine, and to maintain their energy with daily cleaning supplements. Also, more cocaine. This created a feedback loop, where the solution to drug-induced problems was more drugs, and the evidence of the product's effectiveness was actually evidence of chemical dependency. The more exhausted women felt after their cleaning marathons, the more convinced they became that they needed better products and stronger formulations. But what happened when these chemically enhanced cleaning sessions moved beyond simple housework and into the social sphere reveals an even more remarkable chapter in this story. Victorian women began hosting what they called cooperative cleaning parties, social gatherings that combined friendship, community service, and mass chemical consumption in ways that would reshape American social culture forever. Get ready to discover how these innocent-seeming domestic gatherings became some of the most drug-fueled social events in American history, and why Victorian tea parties were often more chemically intense than modern music festivals. Let's step into the powder room of Isabella Worthington's Manhattan mansion on an autumn evening in 1889. Isabella sits before her ornate vanity mirror, surrounded by what looks like an apothecary fever dream. Dozens of crystal bottles, silver jars, and delicate porcelain containers, each promising to unlock the secrets of Victorian beauty perfection. But this isn't just a Skinner routine we're witnessing. This is a nightly ritual of chemical transformation that would make a modern cosmetics chemist run screaming from the room. The Victorian beauty standard was as demanding as it was dangerous. Women were expected to achieve an almost supernatural level of physical perfection. Skin so pale it appeared translucent. Waist so tiny they defied anatomy, and an ethereal, otherworldly appearance that suggested they lived on moonbeams and moral virtue rather than actual food. Achieving this impossible standard required what the beauty industry euphemistically called cosmetic assistants. Products that promised miraculous transformations, but delivered something far more sinister. Isabella's evening routine began with Dr. Mackenzie's Complexion Miracle, a face cream that promised to restore the blooming freshness of youth while invigorating the feminine spirit. The active ingredient, cocaine hydrochloride, at a concentration of nearly 4% combined with lead-based whitening agents and mercury compounds. As she massaged this toxic cocktail into her skin, Isabella felt an immediate tingling sensation that she interpreted as awakening cellular vitality. In reality, she was experiencing the early stages of chemical burns, combined with a cocaine high absorbed directly through her facial tissue, but the face cream was just the beginning. Next came Professor Hendricks' eye brightening solution. Drops that promised sparkling vivacious eyes that captivate and enchant. Each drop contained enough cocaine to dilate pupils dramatically, while numbing the eye tissues. Victorian women believed that the resulting wide-eyed, startled appearance was the epitome of feminine beauty, not realizing they were walking around in a state of drug-induced ocular paralysis. Have you ever wondered why Victorian portrait photographs show women with such distinctive, almost haunting stares? Those weren't natural expressions. They were the result of systematic chemical manipulation of facial muscles and eye function. The beauty industry had weaponized women's insecurities with precision that would make modern marketing executives weep with admiration. They didn't just sell products. They created entire mythologies around feminine inadequacy. Advertisements in ladies' magazines featured before and after illustrations showing the transformation from common woman to ethereal beauty with detailed explanations of how each product addressed specific feminine deficiencies. Madame Roland's Skin Perfection System, widely advertised in Harper's Bazaar and Good Day's Ladies' Book, promised to address what they called the 7 deadly sins of female appearance: sallow complexion, visible pores, facial hair, age spots, wrinkles, dullness, and worst of all, excessive vitality, meaning any sign that a woman was actually alive and healthy rather than otherworldly and fragile. The system consisted of 7 different products, each containing increasingly dangerous combinations of chemicals. The purifying wash contained sulfuric acid and cocaine. The pore-minimizing tonic featured arsenic compounds and morphine derivatives. The complexion perfector combined lead, mercury, and enough stimulants to keep users awake for days. Women weren't just beautifying themselves. They were engaging in systematic self-poisoning while paying premium prices for the privilege. The economic scale of this beauty industrial complex was staggering. By 1892, American women were spending an estimated $89 million annually on cosmetic products, equivalent to nearly $3 billion in today's economy. But unlike modern cosmetics, these weren't just temporary enhancements. They were creating permanent physical and psychological changes in their users. The application techniques themselves were ritualistic and Victorian beauty manuals recommended that women spend 2 to 3 hours daily on their cosmetic routines. applying products in specific sequences with precise timing intervals. The Countess of Pemberton's Guide to Aristocratic Beauty, published in 1888, included detailed instructions for what it called the Complete Transformation Protocol. This protocol began at 4 a.m. with the application of overnight skin renewal compounds, products containing such high concentrations of active chemicals that they literally burned away the top layers of facial skin while users slept. Women would wake up with faces that were raw, sensitive, and completely dependent on additional products to function normally. The morning routine involved protective base applications, creams designed to create a barrier between the damaged skin and the environment. But these protective creams contained their own cocktails of stimulants and narcotics, ensuring that women remained chemically altered throughout their daily activities. The midday refreshment applications were designed to maintain the chemical effects throughout the day. Victorian ladies carried small silver containers of beauty maintenance powders that they would discreetly apply every few hours. These powders contained concentrated cocaine, allowing women to top off their chemical highs while maintaining the appearance of simple vanity touch-ups. The evening routine was the most intensive, involving the removal of the day's chemical layers and the application of overnight treatments that would continue the cycle of destruction and chemical dependency. Women weren't just maintaining their appearance. They were trapped in daily cycles of self-administered chemical abuse. The physical effects were devastating, but interpreted as signs of beauty success. The characteristic Victorian pale complexion that we admire in historical photographs wasn't natural. It was the result of chronic mercury poisoning, combined with cocaine-induced vasoconstriction. The wide-eyed ethereal expressions weren't genetic. They were symptoms of systematic drug use and chemical burns around the eye area. The psychological effects were equally profound. Women using these products reported feelings of confidence, energy, and euphoria that they attributed to looking more beautiful. They described sensations of inner radiance and spiritual elevation that seemed to confirm the product's effectiveness. What they were actually experiencing were the mood-altering effects of cocaine, morphine, and other psychoactive substances absorbed through their skin. To Sarah McKinney Stewart, one of the first African-American female physicians, documented these effects in her 1890s medical practice in Brooklyn. Her patient records preserved at the New York Historical Society described women who came to her complaining of beauty-related maladies, trembling hands, rapid heartbeat, sleeplessness, and what they called excessive facial sensitivity. Dr. Stewart quickly recognized these as symptoms of chronic poisoning and drug dependency. But when she tried to explain the connection to cosmetic products, her patients often refused to believe her. The beauty industry's marketing had been so effective that women would rather suffer serious health consequences than give up products they believed were essential to their social survival. The social pressure to maintain these chemical beauty routines was immense. Victorian women competed over complexion, perfection, with the same intensity that modern social media influencers compete over follow accounts. But this competition was literally toxic, with women constantly escalating their product use to maintain their advantage in the beauty arms race. Ladies' magazines published detailed reviews of cosmetic products that read more like drug comparisons than beauty advice. The 1891 issue of Peterson's magazine included a feature called Comparative Analysis of Complexion Enhancement, systems that evaluated products based on their immediate transformative power, sustained beautification effects, and spiritual elevation properties. All euphemisms for how high the cocaine content was, and how quickly it took effect. The beauty salon industry emerged as sophisticated drug distribution networks, disguised as luxury services. High-end establishments like Madame Zelda's Beauty Temple in Manhattan offered complete feminine transformation experiences. Daeong sessions where wealthy women would submit to intensive chemical treatments administered by trained professionals. These salons were essentially medical facilities operating without oversight, where women underwent procedures that would be considered dangerous even in modern cosmetic surgery practices. Facial peels using concentrated acids, cocaine injections for lip enhancement, and mercury-based treatments for skin lightening were standard services offered alongside tea and conversation. The international scope of this beauty chemical complex was remarkable. American women were using products imported from Paris, London, and Vienna, each claiming regional beauty secrets, while containing essentially the same dangerous chemical combinations. The global trade in beauty chemicals created supply chains that connected Victorian ladies' vanities tables to cocoa plantations in South America, opium fields in Asia, and mercury mines in Europe. But perhaps most tragically, these beauty standards and the chemical means to achieve them were being passed down through generations. Mothers taught daughters to begin using these products as soon as they showed signs of physical maturity, creating multi-generational cycles of chemical dependency disguised as feminine education. The documentation of these generational patterns reveals one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Victorian beauty industry: the way it systematically indoctrinated young women into believing that their natural appearance was inadequate, and that chemical enhancement was not just desirable but morally necessary for proper feminine development. As we delve deeper into this world of chemical beauty standards, we're about to discover how these individual transformations connected to create a city-wide crisis that would ultimately challenge the very foundations of Victorian medical practice. The story of how doctors and the women they treated became locked in a cycle of chemical dependency that neither understood is both tragic and remarkably relevant to our modern struggles with prescription drug culture. Next, we'll explore the examining rooms and consultation chambers where Victorian physicians, armed with good intentions but dangerous ignorance, prescribed treatments that would turn routine medical visits into gateways to chemical dependency that destroyed lives while promising to heal them. Settled into the burgundy leather chair of Dr. Cornelius Whitman's prestigious Beacon Hill office, Mrs. Catherine Pemberton smooths her silk gloves and prepares to describe what she believes are symptoms of moral weakness. It's March 1888, and Catherine is experiencing what we would now recognize as clinical depression following the death of her infant son. But Dr. Whitman, Harvard-educated and considered one of Boston's most progressive physicians, is about to prescribe a treatment that will transform Catherine's grief into something far more dangerous than sadness could ever be. The Victorian medical establishment had created an entire classification system for women's emotional and physical experiences that was both scientifically ignorant and devastatingly effective at turning normal human responses into profitable medical conditions. What they called hysteria encompassed everything from grief and anxiety to simple fatigue or independent thinking. The prescribed treatments read like a drug dealer's inventory disguised as medical wisdom. Doc Whitman opens his leather-bound prescription pad and writes with the confidence of someone who genuinely believes he's practicing cutting-edge medicine. For your melancholic constitution and nervous exhaustion, he explains to Catherine, I'm prescribing Dr. Hammond's nerve and brain tonic, 3 tablespoons daily with meals. Additionally, you'll take Professor Barlow's female restorative, 2 teaspoons every 4 hours for emotional regulation. What Catherine doesn't know is that Dr. Hammond's nerve and brain tonic contains 12% cocaine by volume, while Professor Barlow's female restorative combines cocaine with chloral hydrate, a combination that would make modern emergency physicians declare a medical crisis. But in Whitman's world, this isn't drug dealing. This is therapeutic intervention based on the latest scientific understanding of female psychology. The medical literature of the 1880s reveals the breathtaking scope of conditions that physicians treated with cocaine-based medications. The American Journal of Medicine published articles with titles like The Therapeutic Application of Cocaine in Nervous Disorders of the Female Constitution and Cocoa Preparations in the Treatment of Hystereotic Manifestations. These weren't fringe publications. They were mainstream medical journals read by thousands of practicing physicians across the country. Dr. William Alexander Hammond, former Surgeon General of the United States, wrote extensively about what he called the cocaine solution to female emotional irregularities. His 1887 paper in the New York Medical Journal stated, the female nervous system, being more delicate and susceptible than the male, requires more vigorous intervention to restore proper emotional balance. Cocaine properly administered can transform a weeping, irrational woman into a model of feminine composure and domestic efficiency. Think about the terrifying logic here. The medical establishment was essentially arguing that women's natural emotional responses were pathological conditions, requiring chemical correction. Grief over loss, anxiety about social expectations, fatigue from managing households without modern conveniences. All of these were reframed as medical disorders, requiring pharmaceutical intervention. The prescription patterns revealed the systematic nature of this chemical approach to women's healthcare. A typical nervously exhausted Victorian woman might receive prescriptions for morning stimulants, afternoon mood stabilizers, evening relaxation compounds, and emergency doses for acute emotional episodes. Each of these contained different combinations of cocaine, morphine, alcohol, and chloral hydrate. Catherine's treatment protocol, preserved in Dr. Whitman's patient records at the Massachusetts Historical Society, shows the escalating nature of Victorian psychiatric medication. Week 1. Standard doses of 2 different cocaine-based tonics. Week 3. Increased dosages, plus the addition of morphine-based nerve pills for nighttime anxiety. Week 6. The original medications plus emergency relief powders, containing pure cocaine for what Dr. Whitman termed breakthrough melancholic episodes. By week 8, Catherine was consuming enough controlled substances daily to incapacitate a modern adult. But she was reporting to Dr. Whitman that she felt wonderfully restored and filled with feminine vitality. Her diary entries from this period, donated to the Schlesinger Library by her descendants, read like testimonials from someone experiencing a chemical high. I wake each morning with such energy and clarity. The world seems brighter, my duties lighter, my very soul elevated to realms of profound understanding. What Catherine was actually experiencing was chronic cocaine and morphine intoxication. But both she and Dr. Whitman interpreted her chemical euphoria as evidence of successful medical treatment. The cycle of addiction was being established and reinforced by professional medical authority. The economic relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical companies was openly collaborative in ways that would trigger massive scandals today. Drug companies regularly sent free samples to doctors, sponsored medical conferences, and even paid physicians to write testimonial letters about their product's effectiveness. Dr. Whitman's personal correspondence, preserved in his estate papers, includes dozens of letters from pharmaceutical representatives, offering financial incentives for prescribing specific cocaine-based medications to female patients. One particularly revealing letter from V. Park Davis Company, dated September 1888, offers Dr. Whitman a $500 annual consulting fee, equivalent to nearly $17,000 today, in exchange for prescribing their female nervous system correction kit to at least 50 patients per year. The kit contains 6 different cocaine-based medications designed to be used in sequence throughout a woman's monthly cycle. But the most disturbing aspect of this medical pharmaceutical complex was how it created self-perpetuating cycles of chemical dependency while presenting itself as moral health care. Women who experienced withdrawal symptoms when they missed doses were told they were suffering from recurring nervous weakness that required increased medication. Those who developed tolerance and needed higher doses were diagnosed with progressive female nervous disorders, requiring more intensive pharmaceutical intervention. The diagnostic categories themselves were masterpieces of circular logic, designed to trap women in chemical dependency, while making them grateful for their imprisonment. Chronic feminine melancholy required long-term stimulant therapy. Recurring emotional instability needed continuous mood-altering medication. Domestic nervous exhaustion demanded energy-enhancing pharmaceutical support. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacob, one of the few female physicians of the era, and a graduate of the Paris School of Medicine, began documenting the patterns she observed in her New York practice. Her 1891 paper, Observations on the Physical and Mental Effects of Patent Medicines on Female Patients, was one of the first medical publications to question the widespread use of cocaine-based treatments for women. Dr. Jacob wrote, "I have observed in my female patients a concerning pattern of symptoms that appear to correlate with their use of popular nerve tonics and emotional regulation medications. These include rapid pulse, dilated pupils, excessive energy followed by periods of exhaustion, and what patients describe as intense craving for their medications. Most troubling, patients who attempt to discontinue these treatments experience severe physical and emotional distress that physicians then interpret as evidence that the medications are necessary." Her observations were largely dismissed by her male colleagues, who attribute her concerns to female emotional volatility and suggested she might benefit from nerve tonic treatment herself. The medical establishment's response to Dr. Jacob's warnings reveals how deeply invested they were in maintaining the pharmaceutical approach to women's healthcare. The training of physicians during this era included virtually no education about drug dependency or the physiological effects of long-term stimulant use. Medical schools taught that cocaine was a safe, effective treatment for various conditions, with no mention of addiction potential or withdrawal symptoms. Young doctors entered practice genuinely believing they were helping their female patients while actually creating chemical dependency on an industrial scale. The patient case files from major urban medical practices of the 1880s and 1890s read like documentation of a massive uncontrolled drug experiment. Women were prescribed cocaine-based medications for conditions ranging from headaches and menstrual cramps to grief, anxiety, and what physicians called excessive intellectual activity, meaning women who read too much or expressed opinions too freely. The social class dynamics of this medical drug distribution system were particularly insidious. Wealthy women received more expensive, higher quality cocaine preparations prescribed by prestigious physicians in elegant offices. Middle-class women got standard pharmaceutical cocaine from neighborhood doctors. Poor women were often denied access to these medications entirely, ironically protecting them from chemical dependency while excluding them from what society considered proper medical care. The geographic spread of cocaine-based medical practice followed the same patterns as other Victorian cultural phenomena, starting in major eastern cities and spreading westward along railroad lines and communication networks. By 1890, physicians in small towns across America were prescribing cocaine-based treatments for female patients, having learned these techniques through medical journals and professional conferences dominated by East Coast pharmaceutical interests. The documentation from rural medical practices shows how thoroughly this approach had penetrated American healthcare. Dr. Samuel Morrison's practice records from a small Iowa farming community showed that by 1892, nearly 40% of his female patients were receiving some form of cocaine-based medication, often for conditions that would be considered normal responses to the physical and emotional challenges of frontier life. But perhaps most tragic were the cases where legitimate medical conditions were masked or worsened by cocaine treatment. Women suffering from thyroid disorders, early diabetes, or other serious medical conditions received cocaine for their symptoms, temporarily feeling better due to the drug's stimulant effects, while their underlying conditions progressed untreated. The correspondence between physicians and pharmaceutical companies during this period reveals the extent to which medical practice had become intertwined with chemical sales. Doctors were encouraged to view women's emotional and physical complaints through a pharmaceutical lens. Every symptom represented an opportunity for chemical intervention. Every patient was a potential long-term medication consumer. As this medical-pharmaceutical complex grew more sophisticated and profitable, it began to attract attention from an unexpected source: the very women it was supposedly helping. Some patients began to notice connections between their medications and their symptoms that their physicians had missed or ignored entirely. But the women who started questioning this system faced a medical establishment that had enormous professional, financial, and cultural investment in maintaining cocaine-based treatment protocols. Their journeys from grateful patients to medical reformers would require courage that went far beyond anything Victorian society expected from properly medicated ladies. In our next segment, we'll enter the nurseries and playrooms, where this chemical medical culture was creating its youngest victims. Children whose introduction to life included daily doses of substances that would fundamentally alter their development, while their parents celebrated the miracles of modern pediatric medicine. Through the gleaming mahogany doors of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue mansion, we glimpse a scene that would redefine everything you thought you knew about Victorian high society. The date is October 15th, 1889, and New York's most distinguished ladies have gathered for what appears to be an elegant afternoon tea party. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across silk gowns, servants glide between guests with silver trays, and the conversation sparkles with wit and refinement. But look closer at those delicate teacups, those ornate serving dishes, those charming little bottles the ladies pass discreetly among themselves. This isn't just a social gathering. This is one of the most drudge-intensive events in American social history. Disguised as the height of Victorian respectability, the transformation of elite Victorian social gatherings into sophisticated drug distribution networks happened so gradually and elegantly that even the participants remained largely unaware of what they were creating. These weren't wild parties or underground gatherings. They were the most respectable social events of their era, hosted by women whose names appeared regularly in society pages and whose moral reputations were beyond question. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., the undisputed queen of New York society, pioneered what she called therapeutic entertaining social events, where the refreshments were carefully curated to enhance the guests' enjoyment while addressing their various health concerns. Her famous Monday receptions featured what she termed medicinal refreshments: teas infused with cocaine for nervous ladies, cordials containing morphine for those suffering from social fatigue, and delicate pastries enhanced with the various pharmaceutical preparations. The guest lists for these events read like a who's who of American elite society, but they also functioned as sophisticated customer databases for pharmaceutical consumption. Mrs. Ostera kept detailed records of her guests' preferences for different therapeutic refreshments, essentially tracking their drug consumption patterns while maintaining the facade of gracious hospitality. Think about the social genius of this system. Imagine being able to consume controlled substances in the most socially acceptable setting possible, surrounded by the most respectable people in society, with consumption encouraged and facilitated by women whose moral authority was unquestionable. It was the perfect cover for what was essentially organized drug use among America's social elite. The menu planning for these events was surprisingly sophisticated. The Delmonico's catering records, preserved in the New York Historical Society archives, show detailed specifications for ladies' social refreshments that read more like pharmaceutical formulations than party planning. Afternoon stimulation service included cocaine-infused tea cakes, morphine-laced pest foreplay, and what they called conversation-enhancing cordials, containing various combinations of psychoactive substances. The social protocols that developed around these chemically enhanced gatherings were elaborate and specific. Ladies would arrive at 2 p.m. for what was called preparatory refreshment, essentially a pre-party dose of stimulants to ensure proper energy levels. The main event from 3:05 p.m. featured social sustenance service, with carefully timed distribution of different pharmaceutical refreshments designed to maintain optimal chemical states throughout the gathering. The final phase, departure preparation, involved restorative tonics designed to help guests transition back to their normal domestic responsibilities. But perhaps most remarkably, these events served as informal pharmaceutical consultation sessions. Women would discuss their various health concerns and share recommendations for specific products and dosages. The conversation at these gatherings, recorded in several participants' diaries, reveals detailed discussions of drug effects, tolerance levels, and combination strategies that would sound familiar to anyone who's witnessed modern prescription drug culture. Mrs. Sperrant Fish, another prominent New York hostess, elevated these pharmaceutical social gatherings to new levels of sophistication with her Wellness Wednesdays, weekly events where she invited medical experts to educate her guests about the latest therapeutic products while providing generous sampling opportunities. These weren't medical consultations. They were essentially drug sales presentations disguised as educational social events. The financial scale of these elite pharmaceutical social gatherings was staggering. Mrs. A's household accounts show that she spent more on medicinal refreshments for her social events than most middle-class families spent on food for an entire year. A single afternoon reception might involve $200 worth of pharmaceutical preparations, equivalent to nearly $7,000 in today's money, distributed as party favors and refreshments. The geographic spread of this high society pharmaceutical culture followed the social networks of America's elite families. What started in New York's Fifth Avenue mansions quickly spread to Boston's Beacon Hill, Philadelphia's Main Line, and the grand estates of Newport. By 1890, elite social events from coast to coast featured similar pharmaceutical refreshment services. The servants who worked these events became inadvertent witnesses to the transformation of their employers and guests. The Diary of Mary O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who worked as a parliament for several prominent families, provides a fascinating perspective on what she called the ladies' strange parties. She wrote, "They arrive looking tired and proper, but after an hour of tea and sweets, they become quite different, louder, more animated, talking rapidly about things that seem to excite them greatly. By the end, some are nearly vibrating with energy. Others seem dreamy and distant." What Mary was observing were the predictable effects of cocaine, morphine, and other drugs being consumed in social settings by women who had no understanding of what they were actually ingesting. From the servant's perspective, these gatherings looked like transformation rituals, where proper Victorian ladies temporarily became different people entirely. The children of these elite families were often present at the beginning or end of these events, and their observations recorded in letters and diaries provide additional insight into how these pharmaceutical social gatherings appeared to young observers. 13-year-old Caroline Sherahorn Astor, Mrs. A's daughter, wrote in her diary, "Mother's Monday ladies start quiet and end loud. They laugh at everything and seem to find the wallpaper fascinating. Some dance to music that isn't playing." The social networking that occurred at these chemically enhanced gatherings had real economic and political consequences. Business deals were negotiated, charitable organizations were founded, and social movements were launched by groups of women under the influence of various pharmaceutical preparations. The minutes of the New York Women's Hospital Association, founded at one of Mrs. Fish's Wellness Wednesdays, revealed decision-making processes that were clearly influenced by the participants' altered mental states. The cultural impact extended beyond individual gatherings to influence broader Victorian social customs. The practice of afternoon calling, the formal social visits that structured elite women's daily schedules, became increasingly structured around pharmaceutical refreshment exchanges. Women would visit friends specifically to share new products, compare effects, and coordinate their consumption schedules. The fashion industry responded to these pharmaceutical social gatherings with specially designed accessories. Delicate silver pill boxes became essential elements of formal attire. Tiny crystal bottles for liquid medications were incorporated into evening purses. Some jewelry pieces included hidden compartments for carrying emergency doses of various preparations. The wealthy weren't just consuming drugs socially. They were turning drug consumption into fashion statements. The international dimension of these elite pharmaceutical gatherings was remarkable. American society hostesses maintained correspondence with European counterparts, sharing information about regional pharmaceutical specialties and importing exotic preparations for their guests. Mrs. Disaster's 1891 International Wellness Exposition featured pharmaceutical products from France, Germany, Austria, and England, essentially creating a high-society international drug sampling event. The documentation of these events in society pages and women's magazines required careful euphemistic language that concealed their true nature while celebrating their social importance. Harper's Bazaar regularly featured articles about innovative, entertaining approaches and therapeutic social gatherings without ever directly acknowledging the pharmaceutical nature of these events. But the most significant long-term impact was how these elite pharmaceutical social gatherings normalized and legitimized drug consumption among America's most influential women. When society's moral arbiters were hosting and attending drug distribution events disguised as tea parties, it created cultural permission for pharmaceutical approaches to social and personal challenges throughout all the levels of American society. The influence of these women extended far beyond their immediate social circles. They served on charitable boards, influenced political movements, and shaped cultural trends. Their embrace of pharmaceutical solutions to life's challenges helped create the cultural foundation for America's modern relationship with prescription drugs and chemical wellness approaches. As these elite pharmaceutical social networks grew more sophisticated and influential, they began to intersect with other aspects of Victorian women's lives in ways that would have profound consequences for American society. The story of how these chemically enhanced social gatherings influenced the workplace experiences of Victorian women reveals another dimension of this pharmaceutical transformation of American culture. Our exploration continues into the factories, shops, and offices where Victorian working women discovered that the chemical solutions being celebrated in elite social circles had very different meanings when applied to the harsh realities of industrial labor and economic survival. The factory bell clangs at 5:30 a.m., and to 2-year-old Rose Murphy stumbles through the gates of the Lawrence Textile Mill in Massachusetts, clutching a small brown bottle that she believes contains her salvation. It's January 1892, and Rose faces another 14-hour shift in conditions that would horrify modern labor inspectors. Deafening machinery, suffocating air thick with cotton fibers, and supervisors who view workers as barely more valuable than the thread they produce. But Rose has discovered something that transforms this industrial nightmare into what she describes as bearable, almost pleasant work. That something is Dr. Pierce's golden medical discovery, a cocaine-laced tonic that promises to energize the working woman and sustain her through life's most demanding labors. The intersection of Victorian pharmaceutical culture with industrial working conditions created one of the most exploitative chapters in American labor history, a time when employers discovered they could use women's chemical dependency to extract unprecedented levels of productivity, while workers believed they were simply taking medicine to help them cope with their jobs. Rose's morning routine before her shift reveals the systematic nature of this workplace pharmaceutical culture. At 5 a.m., she takes 2 tablespoons of her energy tonic. At 5:15, she applies what she calls her work cream, a cocaine-infused lotion that promises to strengthen the hands and focus the mind for detailed labor. By 5:25, as she approaches the factory gates, Rose feels energized, alert, and ready to operate dangerous machinery for the next 14 hours without break. But Rose isn't unique. Factory records from the Lawrence Mills, preserved in the American Textile History Museum, showed that by 1893, nearly 60% of female workers were purchasing some form of workplace stimulant from the company store. The mill owners hadn't banned these substances. They'd embraced them as tools for maintaining productivity levels that would have been impossible without chemical assistance. The economics of this workplace pharmaceutical system were brutally simple. Female textile workers earned an average of $6 per week, but they were spending dull 50 cents of that on various stimulant preparations needed to maintain the pace of work required by their employers. The mill owners, recognizing a profitable opportunity, established on-site company stores that sold pharmaceutical products specifically marketed to industrial workers. Think about the perverse logic here. Women were essentially paying their employers for the privilege of chemically altering themselves to tolerate intolerable working conditions. The more dangerous and demanding the work became, the more pharmaceutical products the women needed to purchase to survive their shifts. The product marketing for workplace stimulants was specifically designed to exploit the desperation of working women. Dr. Hartman's Peruna advertised itself as the working woman's friend, providing energy and endurance for those who must labor to survive. Mrs. Pinkham's vegetable compound promised to strengthen the feminine constitution for the demands of industrial life. These weren't general health products. They were specifically formulated and marketed as workplace survival tools. The dosage recommendations for industrial workers were significantly higher than those suggested for middle class women using the same products for nervous conditions. The working woman's version of popular tonics contained 2 to 3 times the cocaine concentration of the version sold to wealthy ladies for their parlor room ailments. The pharmaceutical industry had essentially created different drug formulations based on social class and workplace demands. Mill supervisors quickly learned to recognize the signs of workers who weren't adequately medicated. Women showing normal fatigue, reasonable caution around dangerous machinery, or reluctance to maintain inhuman production speeds were labeled lazy or unsuitable for industrial work. The solution wasn't better working conditions. It was a stronger medication. Sarah Bagley, a mill worker who later became a labor organizer, documented this pharmaceutical workplace culture in her letters to the Lowell Offering, a magazine written by and for factory women. In 1894, she wrote, "The girls here are not themselves. They arrive pale and tired, take their morning medicine, and transform into something almost mechanical in their energy and focus. By afternoon, when the effects wear off, many can barely stand. But they take their second dose and continue until the evening bell." What Sarah was describing was a workplace culture of mandatory chemical dependency, where women's natural physical limitations were overcome through pharmaceutical intervention, rather than humane working conditions. The mill owners had discovered that cocaine-enhanced workers could maintain production levels that were literally impossible for unmedicated human beings. The health consequences were devastating, but carefully concealed by both employers and the pharmaceutical industry. Company medical records, when that they existed at all, attributed workplace injuries and health problems to natural feminine weakness or insufficient constitutional strength for industrial labor, rather than recognizing the role of chemical exhaustion and drug-induced impaired judgment. The variety of workplace stimulants available to industrial workers was remarkable. Morning preparations promised sustained energy for demanding labor. Midday tonics offered renewed strength without interrupting productivity. Evening compounds advertised recovery assistance for the industrious woman. Each product contained different combinations of cocaine, caffeine, alcohol, and other stimulants designed to address different phases of the industrial workday. The most successful workplace pharmaceutical products were those that combined stimulant effects with pain relief. King's new discovery for women promised to eliminate fatigue while numbing the discomfort of repetitive labor. This dual-action approach allowed women to work through injuries, ignore warning signs of physical exhaustion, and maintain dangerous production levels while feeling artificially energized and pain-free. The social dynamics within factories created peer pressure for pharmaceutical use that reinforced the system. Women who could maintain high production levels while appearing energetic and focused became informal leaders and received better treatment from supervisors. Those who struggled to keep up without chemical assistance were marginalized and often fired for inadequate performance. Factory boarding houses, where many mill workers lived, became informal pharmaceutical distribution centers. Older workers would mentor newcomers, not just in job skills, but in pharmaceutical strategies for surviving industrial work. Room sharing often involved sharing medications, creating communal drug dependency that strengthened social bonds while deepening chemical reliance. The geographic spread of this industrial pharmaceutical culture followed the expansion of American manufacturing. From the textile mills of New England to the garment factories of New York, from the food processing plants of Chicago to the tobacco factories of the South, wherever women worked in industrial settings, pharmaceutical companies established targeted marketing campaigns for workplace stimulants. The advertising for these products appeared in publications specifically distributed to working women. The Factory Girl's Friend and Industrial Women's Weekly featured advertisements that spoke directly to the experiences of female industrial workers. Tired after your long shift? Dr. Morton's Working Woman's Tonic will restore your energy for evening responsibilities. Struggling to maintain production quotas? Professor Williams' Industrial Strength Formula provides the extra capability you need, but perhaps most insidiously, some employers began requiring pharmaceutical use as a condition of employment. The Consolidated Textile Company in Rhode Island included in their 1895 employee handbook a section titled Maintaining Adequate Energy Levels that strongly recommended specific pharmaceutical products and dosing schedules for different types of work, while technically not mandatory. Workers understood that failure to maintain chemically enhanced productivity levels would result in termination. The intersection of this workplace pharmaceutical culture with worker safety created a perfect storm of industrial accidents. Women operating dangerous machinery while under the influence of stimulants that impaired judgment and reaction times were injured at rates that shocked even Victorian-era factory inspectors. But rather than addressing the underlying pharmaceutical culture, factory owners installed more safety equipment and hired additional supervisors to monitor workers more closely. The economic exploitation extended beyond simple wage theft. Workers were not only underpaid for dangerous labor, but they were also required to purchase the chemical means to survive that labor from their employers. The mill stores sold pharmaceutical products at significant markups, creating additional profit streams from worker desperation while ensuring that paychecks were immediately recirculated back to company coffers. The long-term health consequences for these working women were severe, but rarely documented in ways that connected them to pharmaceutical use. Mill fever, factory fatigue, and industrial hysteria were recognized medical conditions, but their relationship to chronic stimulant use went unrecognized by medical professionals who were themselves prescribing similar substances to their middle-class patients. As this industrial pharmaceutical culture matured and spread throughout American manufacturing, it began to intersect with broader social movements in ways that would have profound consequences for American society. The story of how chemically dependent working women navigated the complex world of Victorian romance and marriage reveals yet another dimension of how pharmaceutical culture was reshaping the most intimate aspects of American life. The courtship rituals, marriage negotiations, and domestic arrangements that emerged when chemically altered women attempted to form relationships with equally altered partners created social dynamics that would challenge every assumption about Victorian family life and romantic love. Underneath the crystal chandelier of the Grand Ballroom at Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, something extraordinary and terrifying is unfolding on this December evening in 1893. Miss Charlotte Whitmore adjusts her pearl necklace with trembling fingers. Not from nervousness about meeting her suitor, but from the effects of Dr. Hammond's pre-social confidence tonic she consumed an hour earlier. Across the room, Mr. Theodore Ashford straightens his white bow tie while discreetly checking his pocket watch, calculating when he should take his next dose of Professor Williams's Gentleman's Social Vigor supplement. What's about to transpire isn't just Victorian courtship. It's a chemically orchestrated dance between two people whose personalities, emotions, and decision-making abilities have been fundamentally altered by pharmaceutical substances they don't understand. The transformation of Victorian romance and marriage by widespread pharmaceutical use created social dynamics that would make modern relationship therapists question everything they thought they knew about authentic human connection. When both partners in courtship were operating under the influence of powerful psychoactive substances, the very foundations of romantic compatibility, emotional intimacy, and marital consent became chemically complicated in ways that Victorian society never recognized. Charlotte's preparation for this evening began 3 days earlier with what her mother called romantic readiness protocols. Mrs. Whitmore, following advice from Harper's Bazaar's Guide to Proper Courtship Preparation, had Charlotte begin a regimen of Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription for enhancing feminine charm and emotional availability. The medication, containing significant amounts of cocaine and alcohol, was designed to make women more socially engaging, emotionally expressive, and what the advertisements tactfully called romantically receptive. But Charlotte's pharmaceutical preparation extended far beyond simple mood enhancement. Her evening routine included Mackenzie's complexion beautifier, cocaine-based face cream, Professor Ree's eye-brightening solution, cocaine drops for dilated pupils, and Madame Roland's Confidence cologne, an alcohol and stimulant mixture applied to pulse points. By the time she arrived at the Palmer house, Charlotte wasn't just dressed for romance. She was chemically optimized for it. Theodore's preparation was equally sophisticated, but followed masculine pharmaceutical protocols. His morning began with Dr. Kilmer's male vitality tonic, designed to enhance masculine confidence and social dominance. His pre-social routine included Professor Barthelow's gentleman's nerve stadia, cocaine and brandy, and what his pharmacist discreetly called social performance insurance. Various stimulant preparations designed to ensure peak physical and mental performance during courtship activities. Have you ever wondered why Victorian courtship rituals were so formal and structured? Part of the reason was that both participants were often under the influence of substances that impaired judgment while increasing confidence. A dangerous combination that required strict social protocols to prevent scandalous behavior. The pharmaceutical industry had recognized romantic anxiety as a massive market opportunity and developed entire product lines specifically for courtship enhancement. Advertisements in ladies' magazines promised that the right combination of medications could transform any woman into the belle of every ball, while men's publications advertised products that would ensure masculine dominance in all social situations. The courtship correspondence between Charlotte and Theodore, preserved in the Chicago History Museum, reveals the extent to which their relationship developed under pharmaceutical influence. Theodore's letters describe Charlotte as uncommonly vivacious and delightfully animated, while Charlotte writes about Theodore's extraordinary energy and fascinating conversational abilities. What they were actually describing were the effects of cocaine and other stimulants, but they interpreted these chemically induced traits as evidence of exceptional romantic compatibility. The engagement period became an elaborate pharmaceutical coordination process. Victorian etiquette books began including sections on maintaining proper energy levels during the extended courtship activities. Young couples were advised to coordinate their medication schedules to ensure optimal compatibility during social events, family visits, and private conversations. The economic aspect of pharmaceutical courtship was significant. A proper Victorian gentleman was expected to provide his fiancée with wellness support during their engagement, essentially paying for her ongoing medication costs as a demonstration of his ability to provide for her needs. Theodore's financial records show that he spent £47 monthly on Charlotte's various tonics and treatments, equivalent to nearly 100 in today's money. But the most troubling aspect of this chemically mediated courtship culture was how it affected the fundamental question of romantic consent. When both partners were operating under the influence of mood-altering substances that increased confidence while decreasing judgment, were they truly capable of making informed decisions about marriage and intimacy? The wedding industry adapted to accommodate couples whose relationships had developed under pharmaceutical influence. Wedding planning guides included detailed sections on maintaining romantic energy throughout extended celebration periods. Reception menus featured celebration tonics designed to sustain the chemical states that had characterized the couple's courtship. Some wedding invitations even included discreet notations about the availability of refreshment assistance for guests who might need pharmaceutical support to enjoy the festivities appropriately. The marriage ceremony itself often involved pharmaceutical preparation rituals that went unrecognized by clergy and family members. Brides would take wedding day confidence tonics to manage anxiety and ensure appropriate emotional expression. Grooms consumed ceremony, steadiness, preparations to maintain composure during the formal proceedings. The couple exchanging vows were often chemically altered in ways that affected their mental state during one of the most important legal and emotional commitments of their lives. The honeymoon period created unique challenges for couples whose courtship had been sustained by pharmaceutical enhancement. Travel disrupted medication schedules. Unfamiliar environments made it difficult to maintain consistent dosing, and the stress of intimate cohabitation often revealed personality differences that had been masked by chemical alterations during courtship. The correspondence from newlywed couples during this era frequently describes what they called adjustment difficulties that we would now recognize as the challenges of maintaining a relationship when both partners were experiencing changes in their pharmaceutical regimens. Theodore wrote to his brother 3 weeks after his honeymoon, "Charlotte seems quite different from the woman I courted. She is often tired, sometimes melancholy, and lacks the vivacious energy that so captivated me during our engagement." What Theodore was observing were the effects of Charlotte's disrupted medication schedule and possible withdrawal symptoms. But neither he nor she understood the connection between her changed demeanor and her pharmaceutical routine. Instead, they attributed these changes to the natural adjustments of married life, and sought medical advice for what they perceived as Charlotte's declining health. The medical establishment's response to these marital adjustment disorders was predictably pharmaceutical. Doctors prescribed stronger medications, different combinations of drugs, and more frequent dosing schedules to help couples maintain the chemical states that had characterized their successful courtships, rather than recognizing that relationships built on pharmaceutical foundations might be inherently unstable. Physicians doubled down on chemical solutions to chemical problems. The domestic arrangements that emerged from these pharmaceutical marriages were unlike anything in previous human history. Couples coordinated their daily medication schedules to maintain compatibility. Household budgets included substantial line items for health maintenance, the ongoing pharmaceutical costs required to sustain their relationship. Evening routines involved mutual administration of various tonics and treatments, turning marriage into a kind of medical partnership. The children born to these pharmaceutical marriages grew up in households where chemical mood management was the norm. They learned to recognize their parents' medication schedules, understood that family harmony depended on proper pharmaceutical maintenance, and absorbed lessons about using chemicals to manage emotional and social challenges. These children were being raised by parents whose personalities and emotional responses were chemically mediated, creating generational impacts that would shape American family culture for decades. The social expectations around pharmaceutical marriage maintenance were enormous. Victorian wives were expected to manage not only their own medication regimens, but also to monitor and support their husband's pharmaceutical needs. Marriage advice columns regularly featured tips on helping your husband maintain his masculine vitality through proper therapeutic support and ensuring domestic harmony through coordinated wellness routines. The correspondence between married women during this era reveals informal networks of pharmaceutical marriage advice. Women shared information about medication combinations that enhanced marital harmony, dosing strategies for managing domestic conflicts, and product recommendations for maintaining romantic interest over time. These weren't discussions about improving communication or emotional intimacy. They were essentially drug-sharing networks for married couples. The economic burden of maintaining pharmaceutical marriages was substantial. Middle-class families were spending 15 to 20% of their household income on various medications and treatments required to sustain the chemical states that had brought them together. Working-class couples who couldn't afford consistent pharmaceutical support often experienced what they called marriage difficulties, that were actually withdrawal-related relationship problems. The divorce patterns of the era reveal interesting correlations with pharmaceutical access and usage. Couples who maintained consistent access to the medications that had sustained their courtship had lower divorce rates, but higher rates of what medical records describe as domestic nervous disorders. Essentially, the health consequences of long-term drug dependency. Couples who lost access to their medications due to financial constraints often experienced rapid relationship deterioration that was attributed to incompatible temperaments rather than chemical dependency. The legal implications were significant, but rarely recognized. Marriage contracts were being entered into by parties whose judgment was impaired by substances they didn't understand. Domestic violence cases often involved partners whose behavior was altered by pharmaceutical preparations, but the legal system had no framework for understanding how chemical influences affected personal responsibility and criminal behavior. As these pharmaceutical marriages matured and their consequences became more apparent, some members of Victorian society began to recognize patterns that the medical establishment was ignoring or misinterpreting. The story of how some Victorian families began to connect their relationship difficulties to their chemical consumption reveals both the power of pharmaceutical marketing and the resilience of human wisdom when confronted with obvious contradictions. But before we explore that awakening, we need to understand how this chemical approach to human relationships intersected with one of the most powerful institutions in Victorian society, the medical profession itself. The story of how doctors became both the promoters and the victims of the pharmaceutical culture they had helped create reveals the tragic irony at the heart of Victorian drug culture. Coming up, we'll step inside the consulting rooms and private lives of the physicians who had become the primary distributors of chemical dependency, while struggling with their own relationships to the substances they prescribed with such confidence. Behind the heavy oak door of Dr. Harrison Blackwell's private study in Philadelphia, a scene unfolds that would shatter every assumption about Victorian medical authority. It's 3 a.m. on a cold February night in 184, and one of the city's most respected physicians sits hunched over his mahogany desk, his hands trembling as he measures out his fourth dose of cocaine solution since midnight. Dr. Blackwell isn't treating a patient. He's desperately trying to steady his nerves enough to write tomorrow's prescriptions. the same cocaine-based medications that have turned him into a shadow of the confident healer he once was. This is the ultimate irony of Victorian pharmaceutical culture. The very doctors who created the addiction crisis had become its most tragic victims. The medical profession's relationship with cocaine and other pharmaceutical preparations created a feedback loop of dependency that was both professionally sanctioned and personally devastating. Physicians who spent their days prescribing stimulants, sedatives, and mood-altering substances to patients were operating in an environment where chemical solutions to life's challenges weren't just accepted. They were considered scientifically advanced medicine. Blackwell's descent into pharmaceutical dependency began innocently enough, following patterns that were common among his colleagues: the demanding schedule of a Victorian physician, house calls at all hours, complex surgical procedures without modern anesthesia, and the emotional burden of treating patients with limited medical options created stress levels that the era's pharmaceutical solution seemed perfectly designed to address. His morning routine had gradually evolved from simple coffee and breakfast to what he called his professional preparation protocol. At 6 a.m., Blackwell would take what he termed a diagnostic clarity enhancer, cocaine dissolved in wine to sharpen mental acuity for complex medical decision-making. At 7 a.m., he would apply what he called steady hand solution, a cocaine-based lotion rubbed into his palms and fingers to ensure surgical precision during delicate procedures. The American Medical Association's own publications during this era revealed the extent to which pharmaceutical self-medication had become normalized within the medical profession. The Journal of the American Medical Association regularly featured articles with titles like "Maintaining Professional Excellence Through Therapeutic Self-Care" and "The Physician's Duty to Optimize Personal Performance Through Scientific Medicine." William Holstead, one of the founding fathers of modern surgery and the first chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, became so dependent on cocaine that he eventually switched to morphine in an attempt to manage his addiction. His case, documented in medical archives, shows how even the most brilliant medical minds of the era could be destroyed by the substances they prescribed to others with complete confidence. Think about the terrifying implications here. The doctors who were determining appropriate dosages, diagnosing conditions, and making life or death medical decisions were themselves operating under the influence of the same substances they were prescribing to their patients. The blind were quite literally leading the blind, and both groups were walking toward a cliff. The medical culture of the era actively encouraged pharmaceutical experimentation among physicians. Medical schools taught that doctors should personally test new medications to better understand their effects on patients. This professional duty to experience drugs firsthand created a generation of physicians who became inadvertent test subjects for the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Blackwell's personal medical journals, preserved in the College of Physicians of Philadelphia archives, document his gradual realization that his therapeutic self-care had become something much more dangerous. His entries from early 1893 describe using cocaine solutions for enhanced diagnostic intuition and sustained surgical stamina. But by late 1893, his entries reveal a man who was consuming cocaine multiple times daily and had begun experiencing what he euphemistically called professional performance regularities. The peer pressure within medical circles to maintain chemically enhanced performance levels was intense. Physicians who could work longer hours, perform more complex procedures, and maintain higher energy levels gained professional prestige and larger patient loads. Those who relied solely on natural stamina and mental clarity were increasingly viewed as old-fashioned or inadequately committed to modern medical excellence. The economic incentives for physician pharmaceutical use were substantial. Drug companies offered doctors generous discounts on personal purchases of the same medications they prescribed to patients. Some pharmaceutical firms provided professional courtesy samples that allowed physicians unlimited access to new products. The relationship between medical practice and pharmaceutical consumption had become financially intertwined in ways that made objective evaluation of these substances nearly impossible. The correspondence between Victorian physicians reveals informal networks of what we would now recognize as prescription drug sharing and abuse. Dr. Blackwell's letters to colleagues include coded discussions of professional enhancement strategies and therapeutic optimization, techniques that were essentially sophisticated drug trading arrangements between medical professionals. One particularly revealing letter from Dr. James Morrison of Boston, dated March 18th, includes detailed recommendations for managing the professional demands of modern medical practice through strategic pharmaceutical support. The letter describes specific dosing schedules, combination strategies, and techniques for maintaining peak professional performance through chemical means. The medical conferences of the era had become inadvertent pharmaceutical networking events where physicians would share experiences with different substances, compare effectiveness of various preparations, and coordinate access to new products. The American Medical Association's annual meetings included unofficial product evaluation sessions where doctors would discuss their personal experiences with medications they prescribed to patients. The hospital culture of the era reflected and reinforced physician pharmaceutical use. Operating rooms were equipped with surgeons' enhancement stations, cabinets containing various stimulant preparations designed to help physicians maintain focus during lengthy procedures. Hospital pharmacies maintained special professional courtesy inventories that allowed staff physicians unlimited access to various medications for therapeutic professional support. The documentation from major urban hospitals shows that by 1895, pharmaceutical consumption among medical staff had reached levels that would constitute a major public health crisis by modern standards. Massachusetts General Hospital's pharmacy records indicate that physicians and nurses were consuming quantities of cocaine, morphine, and alcohol-based medications that exceeded patient usage by significant margins. The impact on patient care was severe, but largely unrecognized by contemporary observers. Physicians making medical decisions while under the influence of stimulants and sedatives were prone to both overconfidence in their diagnosis and impaired judgment regarding treatment protocols. The very people responsible for healing were operating with chemically altered decision-making capabilities. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacob, one of the era's few female physicians, wrote extensively about what she observed in her male colleagues' behavior. Her 1895 paper concerning certain irregularities in professional conduct among urban physicians documented patterns of erratic decision-making, unusual prescription practices, and what she described as excessive professional confidence unsupported by clinical evidence. The financial toll of physician pharmaceutical dependency was enormous, but rarely discussed openly. Medical professionals were spending substantial portions of their income on drugs for personal use, while billing patients for the same substances. 2. Blackwell's financial records show that he was spending nearly 30% of his professional income on what he categorized as professional development supplies, essentially his personal drug consumption. The family lives of these chemically dependent physicians were profoundly affected by their professional pharmaceutical culture. Medical families normalized chemical solutions to stress, fatigue, and emotional challenges because the head of household was a medical authority who endorsed these approaches both professionally and personally. The children of physicians during this era grew up in households where pharmaceutical solutions to life's problems were not just accepted, but professionally validated. They learned to associate medical authority with chemical intervention and absorbed lessons about using substances to optimize performance and manage difficulties. The wives of addicted physicians occupied a particularly tragic position in Victorian society. They were married to men whose professional reputations depended on maintaining appearances of medical competence, while their personal lives were increasingly dominated by chemical dependency. These women often became enablers and managers of their husbands' pharmaceutical habits while maintaining social facades of professional respectability. The medical establishment's response to growing evidence of physician pharmaceutical problems was predictably denial and rationalization, rather than questioning the safety of substances that were clearly causing problems among medical professionals. The organized medicine community attributed physician difficulties to excessive professional dedication and the natural stresses of advanced medical practice. The pharmaceutical companies encouraged physician dependency through increasingly sophisticated marketing approaches. They created professional development programs that were essentially chemical dependency maintenance systems, disguised as continuing medical education. They offered research opportunities that provided physicians with unlimited access to experimental substances for professional evaluation purposes. As the 1890s progressed, some physicians began to recognize the contradictions between their professional roles as healers and their personal relationships with the substances they prescribed. But challenging a system that had become so deeply embedded in medical culture would require more than individual recognition. It would require organized resistance from within the medical establishment itself. The story of how some Victorian physicians began to question and resist the pharmaceutical culture they had helped create reveals both the power of professional peer pressure and the courage required to challenge established medical orthodoxy when profits, careers, and social standing were all invested in maintaining the status quo. But this medical awakening was about to intersect with the broader social phenomenon that would shake the foundations of Victorian society. The emergence of organized resistance from the very women who had been the primary targets of pharmaceutical marketing. Their fight for recognition and reform would challenge not just medical practice, but the entire economic and social structure that had made the Victorian drug crisis possible. In the flickering gaslight of her modest Brooklyn parlor, something revolutionary is stirring as Mrs. Frances Willard sets down her pen after writing what would become one of the most dangerous documents in Victorian America. The date is September 12, 1895, and the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union has just completed a letter that will challenge the very foundations of American pharmaceutical culture. But this isn't the gentle temperance activism that polite society expects from respectable ladies. This is the beginning of an underground resistance movement that will expose the greatest medical scandal of the 19th century. And the women leading it are fighting not just against alcohol, but against an entire system that has turned their gender into unwitting drug addicts while calling it healthcare. The awakening of Victorian women to their systematic pharmaceutical exploitation didn't happen overnight. But when it began, it spread with the intensity of wildfire through dry prairie grass. These weren't radical activists or social outcasts. They were the very women who had been the pharmaceutical industry's most profitable customers, the respectable wives and mothers whose medicine cabinets had been transformed into drug dispensaries without their knowledge or consent. Frances Willard's journey from pharmaceutical advocate to industry opponent reveals the complex process by which Victorian women began to connect their personal experiences with broader patterns of exploitation. As president of the WCTU since 1879, Willard had initially supported the use of patent medicines as alternatives to alcohol, believing that cocaine-based tonics and morphine-laced syrups were morally superior to drinking. But by 1895, she had begun to recognize that the same pharmaceutical companies promoting temperance were creating dependencies that were often more destructive than alcoholism itself. The transformation began when Willard started receiving letters from WCTU members across the country describing experiences that seemed to follow disturbing patterns. Women wrote about sudden personality changes, unexplained physical symptoms, and what they described as unnatural cravings for their daily medicines. Initially dismissed as individual health problems, these reports began to reveal systematic connections that suggested something much larger was occurring. Mrs. Sarah Henderson of Clio, Ohio, wrote to Willard in March 1895, "I began taking Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription for my nerves 3 years ago on my physician's recommendation. Since then, I have required increasingly larger doses to achieve the same calming effect. When I attempted to discontinue the medicine during a brief illness, I experienced such severe distress, trembling, sweating, and an overwhelming sense of panic that I feared for my sanity. My doctor assures me this indicates my continued need for the medication, but I have begun to suspect otherwise." Sarah's letter was one of hundreds that revealed a pattern the medical establishment refused to acknowledge. Systematic pharmaceutical dependency among Victorian women was creating withdrawal symptoms that were being misdiagnosed as evidence that the medications were medically necessary. The network of communication among WCTU members created an inadvertent surveillance system that could track pharmaceutical effects across geographic and social boundaries. Local chapter reports began documenting correlations between specific products and specific symptoms, creating what was essentially the first grassroots pharmacovigilance system in American history. Have you ever wondered how the information spread before the internet, television, or radio? The WCTU's organizational structure, local chapters in virtually every American community connected through regular correspondence and traveling speakers, created a communications network that could identify patterns and coordinate responses with remarkable efficiency. The evidence that emerged from this informal women's health surveillance network was damning. Products marketed as safe natural remedies were causing identical withdrawal symptoms in women across the country. Medications prescribed by physicians for female hysteria were creating behavioral changes that often made women's emotional problems worse rather than better. Most shocking of all, many popular children's medicines were causing developmental problems that parents had never connected to pharmaceutical use. Willard's strategic genius was recognizing that challenging the pharmaceutical industry required more than moral arguments. It required scientific evidence and political organization. She began coordinating with Dr. Mary Putnam Jacob and other female physicians to document the medical effects of popular patent medicines, while simultaneously building political coalitions that could challenge the industry's regulatory immunity. The Women's Crusade Against Patent Medicine Dependency, launched formally in 1896, represented one of the first organized challenges to pharmaceutical industry power in American history. But the Crusade's tactics were as sophisticated as they were unprecedented. Rather than simply protesting against drug companies, the WCTU created alternative information networks that could bypass the pharmaceutical industry's control over medical communication. The Crusade established women's health education circles in communities across America, essentially grassroots pharmaceutical literacy programs, where women would gather to share information about medication ingredients, discuss symptoms and side effects, and coordinate gradual withdrawal strategies for those who wanted to discontinue their medications. These circles operated outside formal medical authority, creating parallel healthcare systems that prioritized women's actual experiences over pharmaceutical marketing claims. The pharmaceutical industry's response to this organized women's resistance was swift and brutal. Companies launched advertising campaigns that portrayed WCTU activists as hysterical women whose emotional instability made them unreliable sources of medical information. They pressured newspapers to refuse advertisements for WCTU meetings and events. Most insidiously, they worked with physicians to create medical diagnoses that pathized women's resistance to pharmaceutical treatment. Dr. Charles Mills, a prominent Philadelphia physician with financial ties to several pharmaceutical companies, published a paper in 1897 titled "The Pathology of Anti-Medical Sentiment Among Yet Classes of Women." The paper argued that women who questioned their prescribed medications were suffering from a new form of hysteria that required increased pharmaceutical intervention to correct their unnatural resistance to proper medical authority. The economic stakes of this conflict were enormous. By 1896, American women were spending an estimated $120 million annually on patent medicines, equivalent to over $4 billion in today's economy. The pharmaceutical industry recognized that organized women's resistance could threaten their most profitable market segment and mobilized resources to discredit the crusade through both medical and media channels. But the women's resistance movement had advantages that the pharmaceutical industry hadn't anticipated. The WCTU's moral authority made it difficult to dismiss their concerns as purely economic or political. Their documentation methods were more thorough than anything the medical establishment was producing. Most importantly, they had access to information about pharmaceutical effects that was unavailable to anyone else. The daily intimate experiences of thousands of women using these products. The underground pharmaceutical resistance network that emerged during this period was remarkably sophisticated. Women developed coded language for discussing withdrawal strategies in public settings. They created informal distribution systems for information about gradual medication reduction. They established support networks for women attempting to discontinue pharmaceutical dependency, essentially creating the first addiction recovery programs in American history. Mrs. Catherine Mawson of Denver documented her own withdrawal process in a detailed diary that she shared with other WCTU members. Her entries described the physical and emotional challenges of discontinuing medications she had used for 5 years, but also the gradual return of mental clarity and emotional stability she had forgotten she once possessed. "I realize now," she wrote in November 1897, "that what I believed was my natural temperament was actually the effect of daily chemical alteration. I am discovering who I actually am beneath the pharmaceutical mask I have worn for so long." The children of these resistant women often provided additional evidence of pharmaceutical effects that adults had missed or rationalized. Kids noticed when their mothers' personalities changed after taking medications, when their energy levels became artificially elevated or depressed, when their emotional responses became chemically exaggerated. These observations, documented in family letters and diaries, provided compelling evidence that pharmaceutical effects were more obvious to unmedicated observers than to users themselves. The geographical spread of women's pharmaceutical resistance followed existing social reform networks, but created new patterns of political organization. Rural women who had less access to physicians, and therefore more autonomy over their medical decisions, often became early adopters of pharmaceutical resistance strategies. Urban women, more subject to medical authority, but also more connected to reform movements, became the organizational centers for resistance activities. The class dynamics of pharmaceutical resistance were complex and revealing. Wealthy women had greater access to expensive pharmaceutical preparations, but also more social pressure to maintain chemically enhanced appearances and behaviors. Working-class women had less access to medications, but also less social expectation to use chemicals to manage normal human emotions and physical challenges. The documentation from this resistance movement reveals how Victorian women were developing analytical frameworks for understanding pharmaceutical exploitation that wouldn't be formally recognized by medical institutions for decades. They identified the role of marketing in creating artificial health anxieties. They recognized how chemical dependency was being disguised as medical necessity. They understood that pharmaceutical companies were profiting from creating and maintaining problems rather than solving them. The international dimension of women's pharmaceutical resistance was remarkable. WCTU chapters in Britain, Canada, and Australia began coordinating with American activists to share information about pharmaceutical effects and resistance strategies. This created one of the first international women's health advocacy networks focused specifically on challenging pharmaceutical industry power across national boundaries. As this grassroots resistance movement gained momentum and documentation, it began to attract attention from unexpected allies within the medical establishment, journalism, and even government. But the pharmaceutical industry was simultaneously mobilizing resources to discredit women's resistance and maintain their profitable market dominance. The collision between organized women's resistance and pharmaceutical industry power was about to create one of the most significant public health confrontations in American history. The story of how this conflict played out would reshape not only medical practice, but also women's political power and the role of corporate accountability in American society. The next phase of this confederation would move from private parlors and church meetings into the public arena, where the stakes would become not just personal health, but the fundamental question of who had the authority to define women's medical needs and determine their access to accurate information about the substances they consumed daily. Emerging from the shadows of backroom meetings and whispered conversations, a different kind of Victorian entrepreneur was about to transform the American pharmaceutical landscape in ways that would make legitimate businessmen shudder. Meet Mrs. John Josephine Diamond, Jo Murphy, who operated what appeared to be an elegant tea shop on Chicago's North Side, but was actually running one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking operations in American history. The year is 1897. And while proper society debates the morality of patent medicines, Diamond Joe has recognized that the real money lies not in legal pharmaceutical sales, but in serving the countless Victorian women whose doctor-prescribed medications have stopped providing relief. Women who need stronger doses, different combinations, and substances that no respectable physician would ever prescribe. The emergence of an underground pharmaceutical economy was the inevitable result of a medical system that had created massive chemical dependency while maintaining strict moral boundaries around what constituted proper medication. When legal pharmaceutical products could no longer satisfy the tolerance levels of long-term users, and when social expectations made it impossible for respectable women to openly acknowledge their chemical needs, alternative distribution networks filled the gap with ruthless efficiency. Diamond Joe's operation reveals the sophisticated business model that emerged to serve Victorian women's unacknowledged pharmaceutical needs. Her refined ladies' tea emporium was strategically located in a respectable neighborhood where wealthy women could visit without compromising their social standing. The front of the establishment sold legitimate tea blends and social refreshments, but the real business occurred in private consultation rooms, where customers could discuss their specific wellness requirements with Joe's trained associates. The pricing structure was brilliant in its exploitation of Victorian social dynamics. Legal patent medicines cost 50 cents to $2 per bottle, but Diamond Joe's specialized preparations commanded $10 to $25 per dose, equivalent to $3,750 in today's money. The astronomical markup was justified by the discretion, customization, and guaranteed potency that legal pharmaceutical companies couldn't provide. Joe's customer base reads like a who's who of Chicago society, but with a dark twist that reveals the hidden desperation beneath Victorian respectability. Mrs. Catherine Armour, wife of the meatpacking magnate, was a regular customer for what Joe discreetly called energy maintenance compounds. Mrs. George Pullman, the railroads, required specialized preparations for what she described as social performance anxiety. These weren't desperate addicts in the traditional sense. They were respectable ladies whose pharmaceutical needs had evolved beyond what legal medicine could provide. The product development in Joe's operation was surprisingly sophisticated. She employed what she called pharmaceutical consultants, often former pharmacists or medical students who had been expelled or discredited to create custom formulations based on individual customer requirements. The laboratory hidden in the tea shop's basement produced preparations that were more potent, more precisely targeted, and more carefully quality controlled than many legal pharmaceutical products. Have you ever wondered how illegal drug markets develop their expertise? Diamond Joe's operation shows how legitimate pharmaceutical knowledge inevitably flows into underground markets when legal systems fail to meet existing demand. A pattern we've seen repeated throughout history. The delivery system that evolved around Joe's operation was a masterpiece of Victorian discretion. Customers would schedule tea consultations, during which they would receive their pharmaceutical supplies, disguised as specialty tea blends, cosmetic preparations, or household products. The packaging was indistinguishable from legitimate luxury goods, allowing women to transport and store illegal substances without arousing suspicion from family members or domestic staff. The geographic network that Diamond Joe established extended far beyond Chicago. By 1898, she was coordinating with similar operations in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, creating what was essentially America's first organized pharmaceutical trafficking syndicate. The operations were connected through coded correspondence, coordinated pricing structures, and shared supplier relationships that demonstrated remarkable business sophistication. The supplier relationships reveal how underground pharmaceutical networks exploited weaknesses in the legal drug distribution system. Joe's operation purchased raw materials from the same chemical companies that supplied legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers, often through intermediaries who created fictional medical practices and research institutions to justify their purchases. The same cocaine, morphine, and other substances being used in legal medicines were being diverted into illegal markets through paperwork manipulation rather than theft. The corruption of legitimate institutions was extensive but carefully concealed. Several Chicago physicians provided medical consultations for Joe's customers, writing prescriptions that provided legal cover for illegal drug use. Pharmacists would fill obviously fraudulent prescriptions in exchange for percentage payments. Even some police officers received regular payments to ensure that Joe's establishment was never subjected to unexpected inspections. The social dynamics of Joe's customer base revealed the devastating psychological effects of Victorian pharmaceutical culture on upper-class women. Many customers described feeling trapped between their chemical needs and their social obligations, unable to acknowledge their dependency publicly, while increasingly desperate for pharmaceutical relief privately. Joe's establishment became a kind of therapy center where women could openly discuss their drug use, share experiences, and receive non-judgmental support for problems they couldn't mention anywhere else. The customer testimonials from Joe's operation, preserved in police files from her eventual arrest, provide heartbreaking insights into the human cost of Victorian pharmaceutical culture. "I have not felt like myself without my morning preparation for 3 years," wrote one customer. "My family believes I am the perfect wife and mother, but I know I am simply a chemical creation. Yet, when I attempt to return to my natural state, I become someone no one can tolerate, including myself." The pricing psychology of Joe's operation exploited Victorian women's complicated relationship with money and morality. The high cost of her products actually increased their appeal among wealthy customers who interpreted the expensive prices as evidence of superior quality and exclusive access. The financial sacrifice required to maintain their pharmaceutical habits became a form of self-punishment that helped customers rationalize their chemical dependency as a kind of moral suffering. The security measures Joe employed revealed the constant threat of exposure that hung over underground pharmaceutical operations. Her establishment used elaborate code systems for discussing products and transactions. Regular customers were assigned identification numbers rather than using their real names. Payment was often made through third-party intermediaries to avoid creating direct financial connections between customers and the operation. The competition between different underground pharmaceutical operations was fierce and sometimes violent. Joe's success attracted imitators who lacked her sophisticated discretion and quality control, leading to territorial disputes and attempts at industrial sabotage. The underground pharmaceutical market was becoming increasingly organized and competitive, with different operations specializing in different customer demographics and product categories. The law enforcement response to underground pharmaceutical trafficking was hampered by the social status of the customers and the complexity of determining which substances were actually illegal. Many of Joe's products contained the same active ingredients as legal patent medicines, just in higher concentrations or different combinations. Police had difficulty distinguishing between legitimate medical use and illegal trafficking when both involved the same basic substances. The political protection that underground pharmaceutical operations enjoyed came from their customer base, rather than traditional criminal corruption. When the wives and daughters of judges, legislators, and prominent businessmen were customers, law enforcement faced enormous pressure to avoid investigations that might expose their pharmaceutical activities. The underground drug trade was protected by the same social respectability that the legal pharmaceutical industry exploited. The international connections of Jo's operation were remarkably sophisticated. She maintained supplier relationships with pharmaceutical manufacturers in Germany and Switzerland, importation arrangements through Canadian intermediaries, and coordination agreements with similar operations in London and Paris. The underground pharmaceutical trade had become an international business network that operated alongside but separate from legal commercial relationships. The documentation methods used by underground pharmaceutical operations were necessarily different from legitimate businesses, but they were often more accurate in tracking actual customer effects and satisfaction. Jo kept detailed records of customer responses to different products, dosage adjustments and side effects, information that was more clinically useful than anything being produced by the legal pharmaceutical industry. As Diamond Jo's operation grew larger and more profitable, it began to attract attention not just from law enforcement, but from the legitimate pharmaceutical companies whose market share it was stealing. The story of how legal and illegal drug businesses began to conflict and compete reveals the complex relationship between pharmaceutical, regulation, and criminal enterprise. But the underground pharmaceutical economy was about to intersect with broader social forces that would transform both legal and illegal drug markets in ways that no one anticipated. The collision between underground trafficking networks, women's reform movements, and emerging government regulatory power was about to create the framework for modern American drug policy. Our next chapter reveals how the very existence of sophisticated illegal pharmaceutical networks became a powerful argument for increased government regulation, and how the criminal enterprises that emerged from Victorian pharmaceutical culture would ultimately help create the legal and institutional frameworks that still govern American drug policy today. Through the straw corridors of the newly constructed Johns Hopkins Hospital, a different kind of medical crisis was beginning to unfold as the 19th century drew to a close. To William Osler, one of America's most respected physicians, stared in bewilderment at the patient charts scattered across his desk. Dozens of women from Baltimore's finest families, all exhibiting symptoms that defied every established medical category. They trembled without fever, wept without cause, and begged for medications with an urgency that seemed to transcend normal medical need. What Dr. Osler was witnessing, though he didn't yet understand it, was the first wave of a withdrawal epidemic that would force American medicine to confront the monster it had unknowingly created over the previous 2 decades. The medical crisis of the late 1890s emerged as the cumulative effects of widespread pharmaceutical dependency finally became impossible to ignore or rationalize. Hospital emergency rooms in major cities began reporting unprecedented numbers of well-dressed women experiencing what they euphemistically called nervous collapse episodes. Symptoms that we would now immediately recognize as drug withdrawal, but which completely baffled Victorian physicians who had never considered that their prescribed medications might be addictive. The case of Mrs. Elena Whitman provides a perfect example of how this crisis manifested in individual lives. A 4-year-old mother of 3 from Boston's Beacon Hill, Mrs. Whitman had been taking various nerve tonics prescribed by her family physician for nearly 5 years. When a family financial crisis forced her to reduce her medication expenses, she began experiencing what her doctor diagnosed as acute feminine hysteria of unprecedented severity. Dr. Osler's detailed case notes preserved in the Johns Hopkins Medical Archives describe Mrs. Whitman's condition. Patient exhibits severe trembling of the extremities, profuse perspiration despite cool weather, dilated pupils, and an agitation that borders on the manic. Most peculiar is her fixation on obtaining what she terms her morning medicine. She speaks of little else, and becomes increasingly distressed when informed that her previous medications may not be medically necessary. What Dr. Osler was observing was textbook cocaine and morphine withdrawal, but the medical establishment of 1898 had no framework for understanding addiction to substances they had been confidently prescribing as therapeutic remedies. The geographic pattern of this medical crisis was revealing. Cities with the highest concentrations of wealthy women, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, were experiencing the most severe outbreaks of these mysterious nervous collapse cases. Rural areas, where access to expensive patent medicines was limited, reported far fewer instances of similar symptoms. The correlation was obvious to anyone willing to see it. But the medical establishment was institutionally invested in not making that connection. The response from medical institutions reveals the depth of their denial about the pharmaceutical crisis they had created. Rather than questioning the safety of products they had been prescribing for years, physicians developed increasingly elaborate diagnostic categories to explain away the symptoms they were observing. Chronic feminine neurasthenia, hereditary nervous weakness, and constitutional moral insufficiency all became common diagnoses for what were actually withdrawal symptoms. The Johns Hopkins Hospital records show that by 1890, nearly 40% of their female patients were being treated for conditions that would now be classified as substance dependency or withdrawal. But the official medical interpretation was that American women were experiencing an epidemic of nervous disorders that required more intensive pharmaceutical intervention, not less. Think about the tragic irony here. The medical solution to problems caused by pharmaceutical dependency was more pharmaceuticals. When cocaine withdrawal caused depression and anxiety, doctors prescribed stronger stimulants. When morphine dependency created physical distress, they added alcohol-based tonics to ease the symptoms. The medical system was caught in a feedback loop of chemical problems, requiring chemical solutions. The pharmaceutical companies' response to this emerging crisis was masterful from a business perspective, if morally horrifying. Rather than acknowledging that their products might be causing dependency, they launched marketing campaigns that reframed withdrawal symptoms as evidence of underlying medical conditions that required ongoing treatment. "Don't let nervous weakness return," warned advertisements for Dr. Pierce's golden medical discovery. "Maintain your health with consistent therapeutic support." The advertising strategy was brilliant and devastating. By portraying withdrawal symptoms as disease symptoms, pharmaceutical companies convinced both doctors and patients that discontinuing medication was medically dangerous. Women experiencing cocaine withdrawal were told that their anxiety and depression proved they had serious nervous conditions that required lifelong pharmaceutical management. Mary Putnam Jacoby, one of the era's most prominent female physicians, began documenting what she recognized as a systematic pattern of pharmaceutical dependency among her patients. Her 1899 paper, Observations on Chronic Pharmaceutical Dependency Among Women of the Professional Classes, was one of the first medical publications to explicitly connect patent medicine use with addiction symptoms. Dr. Jacob wrote, "I have observed in my practice an alarming increase in women who exhibit signs of physical and psychological dependence on medications they have been taking for supposed nervous conditions. These patients demonstrate classic signs of habituation, increased tolerance requiring higher doses, severe distress when medications are discontinued, and a preoccupation with obtaining and consuming their medicines that exceeds normal therapeutic concern." Her observations were largely dismissed by male physicians who attributed her concerns to feminine emotional sensitivity, and questioned whether women physicians possessed the objectivity necessary for proper medical diagnosis. The medical establishment's response to Dr. Jacobs' warnings reveals how thoroughly the pharmaceutical industry had captured medical opinion during this period. The hospital records from major urban medical centers provide statistical evidence of the crisis that medical authorities refused to acknowledge officially. Massachusetts General Hospital admitted thrift women for nervous disorders in 1899 compared to 23 similar cases in 1875. Presbyterian Hospital in New York reported a 400% increase in feminine hysteria cases between 1885 and 1900. The pattern was consistent across the country. Wherever patent medicine use was highest, mysterious nervous conditions among women were reaching epidemic proportions. The social response to this medical crisis reveals how deeply pharmaceutical dependency had penetrated Victorian culture. Families began organizing their daily routines around the pharmaceutical needs of dependent mothers and wives. Household budgets included substantial line items for medical maintenance. Social events were planned around medication schedules. An entire lifestyle had emerged that treated chemical dependency as normal healthcare management. The impact on children in these families was profound, but rarely acknowledged. Kids learned to recognize their mother's pharmaceutical schedules and adjust their behavior accordingly. They absorbed lessons about using chemicals to manage emotional challenges and came to view daily drug consumption as normal adult behavior. These children were being raised in environments where chemical dependency was modeled as proper self-care and medical responsibility. The international medical community began to take notice of what appeared to be a uniquely American epidemic of women's nervous disorders. British medical journals published articles questioning whether American lifestyle or medical practices might be contributing to the apparent crisis in feminine mental health. German physicians suggested that American women's nervous systems might be inherently weaker than those of European women. The reality, of course, was that American pharmaceutical consumption among women vastly exceeded that of other countries. But this connection was not made explicitly by international observers who assumed they were witnessing a social rather than chemical phenomenon. The economic impact of this medical crisis extended far beyond individual healthcare costs. Families were spending increasing portions of their income on medications and medical consultations. Businesses were losing productive employees to frequent medical appointments and nervous exhaustion absences. The pharmaceutical dependency that had started as a solution to women's social and medical challenges was becoming a drag on the broader American economy. The insurance industry began developing policies specifically designed to exclude coverage for what they termed chronic feminine nervous conditions. Insurance executives had recognized that these cases involved ongoing expensive treatment with poor outcomes, but they interpreted the problem as the inherent female medical weakness rather than pharmaceutical dependency. As the medical crisis deepened and its cost became more apparent, some members of the medical establishment began to question their fundamental assumptions about pharmaceutical treatment. But challenging a system that had become so deeply embedded in both medical practice and social expectation would require courage that went beyond individual recognition. It would require organized resistance from within the medical establishment itself. The transformation of this medical crisis from a collection of individual health problems into a recognized public health emergency would depend on factors that were developing simultaneously in journalism, politics, and social reform movements. The collision between medical denial and mounting evidence was about to create the conditions for one of the most dramatic reforms in American medical history. But first, we need to understand how this medical crisis was intersecting with broader social changes that were transforming American attitudes toward authority, expertise, and the role of government in protecting public health. The story of how Victorian pharmaceutical culture finally began to collapse reveals both the power of entrenched interests and the eventual triumph of evidence over profit. Standing before the marble columns of the New York State Capitol on a crisp October morning in 1901, Reverend Wilbur Crafts raises his voice above the crowd of protesters, reformers, and curious onlookers who have gathered for what newspapers are calling the most significant moral confrontation of the new century. But this isn't a typical temperance rally or suffrage demonstration. Dr. Crofts, representing the newly formed Coalition for American Moral Health, is leading the first organized public protest against the pharmaceutical industry in American history. And the target of their outrage isn't alcohol or gambling, but the patent medicine companies that have systematically addicted an entire generation of American women while hiding behind the veneer of medical respectability. The moral panic that erupted around Victorian pharmaceutical culture in the early 1900s created one of the most dramatic shifts in American public opinion in the nation's history. Within the span of just 5 years, patent medicines went from being celebrated as scientific advances to being condemned as instruments of moral destruction. And the companies that produced them were transformed from respected businesses into symbols of corporate evil. The catalyst for this transformation was the convergence of several social forces that had been building independently throughout the 1890s. The women's reform movement had documented systematic pharmaceutical exploitation. Medical professionals were beginning to acknowledge the dependency crisis they had helped create. Journalists were investigating the gap between pharmaceutical marketing claims and actual product safety. But it was the moral reform movement that provided the rhetorical framework and political organization necessary to turn these desperate concerns into a unified crusade for pharmaceutical regulation. Dr. Crafts and his coalition understood something that other critics of patent medicines had missed. The American public would respond more strongly to moral arguments than to medical or economic ones. By reframing pharmaceutical dependency as a moral crisis rather than a health crisis, the Coalition for American Moral Health created a political coalition that included religious leaders, women's rights activists, physicians, and middle-class families who were witnessing the effects of pharmaceutical culture in their own communities. The moral framework that emerged during this period was both powerful and problematic. On one hand, it provided the political energy necessary to challenge the pharmaceutical industry's political and economic power. On the other hand, it stigmatized the victims of pharmaceutical dependency by portraying them as morally weak, rather than recognizing them as targets of systematic exploitation. The rhetorical strategy employed by moral reformers was sophisticated and emotionally compelling. They didn't just argue that patent medicines were medically dangerous. They argued that pharmaceutical dependency was destroying the moral foundation of American family life. Mothers who were chemically dependent couldn't provide proper moral guidance to their children. Wives who required daily doses of stimulants weren't fulfilling their natural roles as moral centers of their households. The pharmaceutical industry wasn't just harming women's health, it was corrupting the institution of motherhood itself. Have you ever noticed how moral arguments often succeed where practical arguments fail? The Coalition for American Moral Health understood that Americans would accept significant economic disruption and political conflict to protect what they perceived as fundamental moral values, even when they might ignore purely practical concerns about public health or economic exploitation. The Coalition's first major public demonstration, held simultaneously in 12 major cities on October 15, 1901, drew crowds that totaled more than 50,000 people. The demonstrations weren't just protests. They were carefully orchestrated public education events designed to expose the contents and effects of popular patent medicines to audiences who had never questioned the safety of products they'd been using for years. The most dramatic element of these demonstrations was what organizers called pharmaceutical revelation ceremonies, public displays where popular patent medicines were analyzed and their contents revealed to shocked audiences. When demonstrators poured Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup into test tubes and showed how much morphine was required to match a single dose, the crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. The newspaper coverage of these demonstrations marked a turning point in public awareness of pharmaceutical issues. The New York World's headline read, "Mothers unknowingly drugged their babies. Popular children's medicine contains enough morphine to addict adults." The Chicago Tribune published a series titled, "The Patent Medicine Conspiracy: How Respectable Companies Have Poisoned American Families." These weren't opinion pieces or editorials. They were investigative news stories that treated pharmaceutical dependency as a major public scandal. The political response to this moral panic was swift, but complicated by the economic and political power of the pharmaceutical industry. Companies like Lydia Pinkham's and Pierce's employed thousands of workers and generated millions in tax revenue. Many newspapers depended on patent medicine advertising for their financial survival. Politicians had received substantial campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies for decades. But the Moral Coalition had advantages that previous critics of patent medicines had lacked. They had organized support from religious institutions across the country. They had documentation of pharmaceutical effects that was more comprehensive than anything the industry had produced. Most importantly, they had successfully reframed the debate from a question of medical regulation to a question of protecting American families from corporate exploitation. The counterattack from the pharmaceutical industry was immediate and well-intended. Companies launched advertising campaigns that portrayed moral reformers as religious fanatics who wanted to deprive sick people of necessary medical treatment. They hired prominent physicians to write articles defending patent medicines as safe and effective. They threatened to withdraw advertising from newspapers that supported regulatory reform. The industry's most effective argument was that government regulation of patent medicines would interfere with Americans' freedom to make their own medical decisions. This libertarian argument resonated with many people who were suspicious of government power but hadn't fully understood the implications of unregulated pharmaceutical marketing. The battle for public opinion during this period reveals the sophisticated propaganda techniques that both sides employed. The Coalition for American Moral Health organized speaking tours, where reformed pharmaceutical users would share their experiences with addiction and recovery. The pharmaceutical industry sponsored medical conferences, where physicians would present research supporting the safety of popular products. The children's angle proved to be the most politically powerful aspect of the moral reformers' argument. When the coalition documented that products marketed specifically for infants and toddlers contained enough narcotics to addict adults, public opinion shifted dramatically against the pharmaceutical industry. The idea that respected companies were systematically drugging children for profit was more shocking to the American public than evidence of adult pharmaceutical dependency. The economic arguments that emerged during this period were as compelling as the moral ones. Families were spending enormous portions of their household budgets on pharmaceutical products that were creating rather than solving health problems. Businesses were losing productivity due to employees' pharmaceutical-related health issues. Insurance companies were paying increasing amounts for medical treatment of conditions that were actually caused by patent medicine use. The international dimension of this moral panic was significant. European observers had been commenting on Americans' unusual pharmaceutical consumption patterns for years. But the moral reform movement provided a framework for understanding these observations as evidence of a systematic social problem, rather than individual American weaknesses. The documentation produced during this period of moral awakening was more comprehensive and methodologically sound than anything previously available about pharmaceutical effects. The coalition organized systematic data collection about patent medicine contents, usage patterns, and health outcomes. This research provided the empirical foundation for regulatory reforms that would follow. The political organization that emerged from this moral panic created lasting changes in American reform movements. The Coalition for American Moral Health demonstrated that effective political action required coordination between different types of organizations: religious groups, women's organizations, medical professionals, and concerned citizens, working together around shared moral principles rather than narrow sectoral interests. As this moral awakening gained political momentum, it began to attract attention from government officials who recognized that pharmaceutical regulation had become a major political issue that could no longer be ignored. But the pharmaceutical industry was simultaneously mobilizing its considerable resources to influence the regulatory process and minimize the impact of reform efforts. The collision between this moral reform movement and the pharmaceutical industries. Political power was about to create the framework for modern American drug regulation, but the final outcome would depend on political battles that were just beginning to unfold in the halls of Congress and the offices of federal bureaucrats who had never before been asked to regulate an industry as powerful and profitable as Victorian pharmaceutical manufacturing. Our final chapters will reveal how this moral crusade ultimately transformed into the legal and regulatory framework that still governs American pharmaceutical policy today. And lessons learned from the Victorian drug crisis continue to shape our modern struggles with prescription drug abuse, corporate accountability, and the role of government in protecting public health. Within the marble-walled chambers of the United States Capitol, a legislative battle was about to unfold that would reshape the relationship between American government and corporate power forever. On June 23, 1906, Congressman James Robert, man of Illinois, rose to address his colleagues about what he called the most critical public health legislation in our nation's history. The Pure Food and Drug Act was facing its final vote. But the forces arrayed against it represented more than just pharmaceutical companies protecting their profits. This was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of American society. One where corporations could operate without meaningful oversight, and another where government had the responsibility to protect citizens from industrial exploitation. The political battle over pharmaceutical regulation reveals how deeply the Victorian drug crisis had penetrated American institutions and how difficult it would be to extract the tentacles of chemical dependency from the body politic. The pharmaceutical industry had spent decades building relationships with politicians, journalists, and medical authorities that created a web of financial and professional interests, all invested in maintaining the status quo. The legislative history of the Pure Food and Drug Act shows how reform movements transformed moral outrage into political action, but also reveals the compromises and limitations that resulted from the enormous power of the industries being regulated. The original bill, introduced in 1902, would have banned the sale of any patent medicine containing cocaine, morphine, or alcohol without clear labeling and medical supervision. By the time it reached its final vote 4 years later, it had been significantly weakened by pharmaceutical industry lobbying. Congressman Mann's speech to the House reveals both the moral urgency and political calculation involved in this historic legislation. "We face a choice," he declared, "between the profits of a few corporations and the health of American families. The evidence before us shows that companies we have trusted with our most precious possessions, our wives and children, have systematically deceived and poisoned us for profit. No industry, however profitable or politically connected, should be permitted to continue such practices." But the opposition arguments were equally compelling from a political perspective. Representative William Scherr of New York, who had received substantial campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies, argued that government regulation of medicine would interfere with Americans' constitutional right to make their own healthcare decisions. "Are we to become a nation," he asked, "where bureaucrats in Washington determine what medicines American citizens may purchase to treat their ailments?" The debate over the Pure Food and Drug Act was really a debate about the proper role of government in protecting citizens from corporate power, and it established precedents that continued to shape American regulatory policy today. The pharmaceutical industry argued that market forces would naturally eliminate dangerous products as consumers learn to avoid them. Reformers countered that the complexity of pharmaceutical chemistry made it impossible for consumers to make informed decisions without government oversight. Have you ever wondered how we establish the principle that government has the authority to regulate what companies can sell to consumers? The Victorian pharmaceutical crisis created the political conditions that made such regulation not just possible, but necessary for social stability. The lobbying efforts surrounding this legislation were unprecedented in their scope and sophistication. The Proprietary Association of America, representing patent medicine manufacturers, spent an estimated $2 million, equivalent to over $1 million today, fighting the Pure Food and Drug Act. They hired former congressmen as lobbyists, funded speaking tours by physicians who supported patent medicines, and threatened to withdraw advertising from newspapers that supported regulation. The Reform Coalition's response was equally sophisticated, but operated with much smaller financial resources. The Coalition for American Moral Health organized letter-writing campaigns that flooded congressional offices with testimonials from families affected by pharmaceutical dependency. Women's organizations coordinated visits to legislators in their home districts, bringing along mothers whose children had been harmed by patent medicines. The role of journalism in this legislative battle was crucial and complicated. Many newspapers depended on patent medicine advertising for their survival, creating conflicts of interest that affected their coverage of the regulatory debate. The pharmaceutical industry's advertising contracts often included clauses that allowed companies to withdraw their business if publication supported regulation. But a new generation of investigative journalists, led by Samuel Hopkins Adams of Collier's Weekly, began exposing the financial relationships between pharmaceutical companies and the media outlets that covered them. Adams' series, The Great American Fraud, documented how patent medicine advertising influenced newspaper editorial policies and revealed the financial incentives that shaped public information about pharmaceutical products. The international dimension of this regulatory battle was significant. European countries had begun implementing pharmaceutical regulations years before the United States, and American reformers used international comparisons to argue that the US was falling behind other developed nations in protecting public health. The pharmaceutical industry countered that European regulations were stifling innovation and economic growth. The economic arguments on both sides of this debate revealed the complex relationship between public health and economic development. The pharmaceutical industry employed tens of thousands of workers and generated millions in tax revenue. Many communities depended on patent medicine manufacturing for their economic survival. Regulation threatened to disrupt established economic relationships that extended far beyond the companies themselves. But the reformers had economic arguments of their own. They documented the costs of pharmaceutical dependency, lost productivity, increased medical expenses, and the economic burden on families struggling with chemically dependent members. They argued that short-term economic disruption would be more than offset by long-term improvements in public health and productivity. The final version of the Pure Food and Drug Act that passed in 1906 was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but represented a historic expansion of federal regulatory authority. The act required pharmaceutical companies to list certain dangerous ingredients on their labels, but it didn't ban these substances or require proof of safety or efficacy. It was a first step toward comprehensive pharmaceutical regulation, but only a first step. The implementation of the new law revealed both its strengths and limitations. Companies began reformulating their products to avoid labeling requirements, often substituting unlisted dangerous substances for those that now had to be disclosed. The Bureau of Chemistry, tasked with enforcing the new regulations, had limited resources and expertise to monitor the thousands of pharmaceutical products on the market. The public response to the new labeling requirements was immediate and dramatic. When consumers could see that their health tonics contained significant amounts of alcohol, cocaine, and morphine, many stopped purchasing these products entirely. Sales of patent medicines dropped by an estimated 30% in the first year after the law's implementation. But the pharmaceutical industry adapted quickly to the new regulatory environment. Companies invested heavily in marketing campaigns that emphasized the natural and safe ingredients in their reformulated products. They developed new euphemistic language that described dangerous substances in ways that avoided regulatory scrutiny while maintaining their psychoactive effects. The enforcement challenges that emerged during the first years of pharmaceutical regulation established patterns that continue to affect drug policy today. The government had limited resources for monitoring compliance. companies had strong incentives to find ways around regulations. And the technical complexity of pharmaceutical chemistry made it difficult for regulators to stay ahead of industry innovation. The success stories from this period of early pharmaceutical regulation were significant but limited. Children's medications became much safer, as companies removed the most dangerous ingredients from products marketed to parents. Some of the most egregiously misleading advertising claims were eliminated. The principle that government had authority to regulate pharmaceutical safety was established in law and accepted by the public. The political coalition that achieved pharmaceutical regulation in Testo 6 represented a new model for American reform movements. It combined moral authority from religious organizations, practical expertise from medical professionals, grassroots organization from women's groups, and political skill from experienced reformers. This coalition model would be replicated in later reform efforts, addressing other aspects of industrial capitalism. As the first phase of pharmaceutical regulation took effect, it became clear that the Pure Food and Drug Act was not an ending, but a beginning. The Victorian drug crisis had been partially addressed, but the underlying tensions between corporate profit and public health remained unresolved. The legacy of this regulatory battle would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century and into our modern era, as each generation would face new versions of the same fundamental questions. How much should government interfere with free markets to protect public health? Who should determine what substances are safe for public consumption? How do we balance individual freedom with collective security? Our final chapter will reveal how the lessons learned from the Victorian pharmaceutical crisis continue to resonate in our modern struggles with prescription drug abuse, corporate accountability, and the ongoing challenge of protecting public health in an era of unprecedented pharmaceutical innovation and marketing sophistication. Fast forward to our modern world, where a mother in suburban Atlanta checks her medicine cabinet and finds bottles of prescription opioids for her back pain, Adel for her attention issues, and Xanax for her anxiety. A pharmaceutical collection that would make a Victorian lady's medicine cabinet look quaint by comparison. The parallels between Victorian cocaine culture and our modern prescription drug crisis are so striking they should make us all pause and ask, have we really learned anything from history? Or are we simply repeating the same patterns with more sophisticated marketing and better legal protection? The echoes of Victorian pharmaceutical culture resonate through every aspect of our modern relationship with prescription drugs. Today, American women are prescribed psychiatric medications at rates that dwarf Victorian cocaine consumption. We spend over $300 billion annually on prescription drugs, an amount that makes the Victorian patent medicine industry look like a neighborhood lemonade stand. Most telling of all, we've recreated the same cycle of chemical dependency, disguised as medical treatment, that destroyed so many Victorian families. The marketing techniques that pharmaceutical companies use today would make Victorian patent medicine advertisers weep with admiration. Instead of advertising in ladies' magazines, modern drug companies spend billions on television commercials that encourage consumers to ask your doctor about specific medications. The Victorian promise of chemical solutions to life's emotional challenges has evolved into direct-to-consumer advertising that suggests pharmaceutical answers to everything from social anxiety to seasonal mood changes. The medical establishment's role in our modern pharmaceutical culture mirrors the Victorian pattern with uncomfortable precision. Today's physicians, like their Victorian predecessors, operate within systems that reward pharmaceutical solutions over time. Intensive behavioral interventions. Insurance companies reimburse 15-minute medication consultations more generously than hour-long therapy sessions, creating the same economic incentives for chemical treatment that drove Victorian medical practice. The gender dynamics of modern pharmaceutical marketing follow Victorian patterns, with remarkable consistency. Women are still the primary target market for mood-altering medications, still portrayed as emotionally fragile beings who require chemical assistance to manage normal human experiences. The Victorian diagnosis of hysteria has been replaced by labels like anxiety disorder and depression, but the underlying assumption remains the same. Women's emotional responses to difficult life circumstances are medical problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions. Perhaps most troubling is how we've recreated the Victorian normalization of chemical dependency among children. The explosion in pediatric psychiatric medication prescriptions mirrors the Victorian practice of medicating children for behavioral compliance. We've replaced Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup with Ritalin and Adderall, but we're still using powerful psychoactive substances to make children conform to adult expectations, rather than addressing the environmental factors that might be causing their distress. The regulatory framework we inherited from the Victorian pharmaceutical crisis has proven inadequate for our modern challenges. The FDA requires drug companies to prove safety and efficacy before bringing products to market, but it doesn't evaluate the social and psychological effects of widespread pharmaceutical use. We've prevented another Victorian-style crisis of completely unregulated drugs. But we've allowed the creation of a more sophisticated system of medically supervised chemical dependency. Think about the irony here. We look back at Victorian women consuming cocaine-laced tonics and shake our heads at their ignorance, while modern Americans consume prescription amphetamines, benzodiazepines, and opioids at unprecedented rates. The substances have changed, the delivery systems have improved, but the fundamental pattern of using chemistry to solve social and emotional problems remains remarkably consistent. The economic model of modern pharmaceutical dependency follows Victorian patterns, but on a vastly larger scale. Victorian women spend significant portions of their household budgets on patent medicines. Modern Americans spend thousands annually on prescription drugs, while insurance companies and government programs subsidize pharmaceutical company profits. We've socialized the costs of pharmaceutical dependency while privatizing the profits, creating a system even more favorable to drug companies than the Victorian free market approach. The social networking around pharmaceutical use has evolved from Victorian tea parties to online communities where people share experiences with different medications, compare effects and side effects, and support each other through withdrawal and dependency challenges. The medium has changed, but the human need to connect with others who understand the experience of chemical dependency remains constant. The most sobering parallel between Victorian and modern pharmaceutical culture is how both eras created vast populations of people whose personalities and emotional responses were chemically mediated without their full understanding of the implications. Victorian women often didn't realize they were consuming cocaine daily. Modern Americans often don't understand the long-term neurological effects of psychiatric medications they've been taking for years. But there's hope in understanding these historical patterns. The Victorian pharmaceutical crisis eventually sparked reforms that created our modern regulatory system. Our current prescription drug crisis is generating new awareness of pharmaceutical industry power and new demands for accountability and reform. History suggests that periods of pharmaceutical excess eventually create backlash that leads to better protections and more sustainable approaches to medical treatment. The lessons from Victorian pharmaceutical culture are clear. Chemical solutions to social problems inevitably create more problems than they solve. Sustainable health requires addressing the environmental, social, and economic factors that create distress, not just medicating the symptoms. Most importantly, we must remain skeptical of industries that profit from our problems, rather than solving them. As we've seen throughout this incredible journey through Victorian pharmaceutical culture, the same human vulnerabilities that made our ancestors susceptible to cocaine-laced patent medicines make us vulnerable to modern pharmaceutical marketing. The promise of quick chemical fixes for life has challenges is as seductive today as it was 100 years ago, and the industries that profit from that promise are more powerful and sophisticated than ever. Understanding this history doesn't mean rejecting all pharmaceutical interventions. Modern medicines have saved countless lives and improved human welfare in ways Victorian physicians could never have imagined. But it does mean approaching pharmaceutical solutions with a healthy skepticism that our Victorian ancestors lacked, demanding evidence, rather than marketing claims, and remembering that our ancestors' tragic mistakes can become our wisdom if we're willing to learn from them. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating and sobering journey through one of history's most overlooked medical scandals. The story of Victorian pharmaceutical culture reminds us that progress isn't always linear, that industries that claim to serve our health don't always have our best interests at heart, and that sometimes the most dangerous substances are those that promise to make us feel better. I hope this exploration has given you a new perspective on both historical and modern pharmaceutical culture, and perhaps inspired you to look more critically at the chemical solutions we re-offered for life's inevitable challenges. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that our ancestors' experiences, both their mistakes and their wisdom, can guide us toward better choices if we're willing to listen to their stories. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the strange, surprising, and endlessly instructive world of forgotten